consider, for a moment, the nature of great historical movements. We speak of them as singular events. The Crusades began. We say, as though a switch was thrown, as though history moved by decree alone. But stand closer. Look with care at the year 1095, and you will see something far more intricate. You will see not one cause, but a convergence, a meeting of rivers, each flowing from its own source, each carrying its own burden, joining together to create a flood that would sweep across 2 continents and reshape the world. Picture the eastern reaches of the Roman world. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople has stood the great city astride 2 continents, where Europe meets Asia, where the Golden Horn meets the Bosporus. The heirs of Caesar Augustus still reign here, though they call themselves by the Greek word Basileus. This is Byzantium, the eastern half of the Roman legacy, and it is in mortal danger. The threat comes from the east. The Seljuk Turks, a people who had entered history as nomads from the Asian steppes, have transformed themselves into conquerors of extraordinary capability. In 1071, at a place called Manzikert in the Armenian highlands, they achieved something remarkable and terrible. They destroyed a Byzantine army. They captured an emperor, and in the chaos that followed, they swept across Anatolia like a tide. Anatolia. The name means little to us now, but to Byzantium it meant everything. This was the heartland, the breadbasket that fed Constantinople, the recruiting ground that supplied the empire's armies, the buffer that separated the capital from its enemies. And now it was gone. In barely 20 years, territories that had been Roman for 1,000 years, lands where Greek had been spoken since the age of Alexander, had fallen under Turkish rule. Imagine being Emperor Alexios Komnenos in the year 1095. You are brilliant, capable, and you have clawed your way to power through civil war and political intrigue. You have stabilized an empire that seemed on the verge of collapse, but the fundamental problem remains unsolved. Your army is too small, your treasury is depleted. The Turks camp within sight of the sea that separates them from your capital. One determined push, and Constantinople itself might fall. So Alexios makes a decision. It is calculated, pragmatic, the sort of decision that desperate rulers have made throughout history. He will ask for help, not from his neighbors, they are weak or hostile, but from the West, from the Latins, from those rough warrior peoples beyond the Adriatic who share, nominally at least, the same Christian faith. He sends letters to Pope Urban II, and he asks, very specifically, for mercenaries, controllable forces, professional soldiers who will fight for Byzantine gold, help recover Anatolia, and then go home. What he receives instead will exceed his darkest nightmares and most ambitious hopes in equal measure. Now, turn your attention westward. Cross the Adriatic. Here is Western Europe in the late 11th century, and it presents a puzzle. This is a civilization ascending. Population is growing. Agriculture is improving. New lands are being cleared. New towns founded. Technology advances. The great cathedrals begin to rise. This is the early stirring of what will become medieval Christendom's high civilization. But there is a problem, and it is violence. Medieval Europe is awash in it. This is a warrior society, a place where power flows from the sword and status derives from martial prowess. The nobility, from great dukes down to minor knights, are professional fighters. It is their identity, their purpose, their livelihood. And when they are not fighting external enemies, they fight each other. The countryside bleeds. Feuds between noble families cascade into private wars. Knights raid each other's lands. Peasants are caught in the crossfire. The Church attempts to limit this chaos through institutions like the Peace of God and the Truce of God declarations that certain days are off limits for warfare, that certain people and places are protected. But these are fragile restraints, honoured more in the breach than the observance. Into this cauldron of violence comes a man who sees opportunity where others see only crisis. Urban II is pope, but his power is contested. An anti-pope sits in Rome, backed by the German emperor. Urban's authority over the church itself is uncertain. The Great Schism of 1054, when the Eastern and Western churches formally split, still wounds. Urban has ambitions. He wants to reunify Christendom under papal authority. He wants to demonstrate that the Pope, not kings or emperors, commands the faithful. He wants to redirect Europe's violence outward, against external enemies, rather than letting it consume Christian lands from within. When Alexios's appeal arrives, Urban sees something the Byzantine emperor never intended. He sees a chance to achieve all his goals at once. In November of 1095, Urban travels to France, to a town called Clermont, and there, in a field outside the city walls, he delivers a speech that will echo through the centuries. We do not know his exact words. The accounts that survive were written later, each shaped by the author's own perspective. But we know the essence. He speaks of the suffering of Eastern Christians under Muslim rule. He speaks of the desecration of holy places. He speaks of Jerusalem, the city where Christ died and rose, now held by unbelievers. And he makes an offer that transforms religious devotion into military strategy. Go east, he says, take up the cross, free Jerusalem, and in return, the Church will grant complete remission of sins, a plenary indulgence, the guarantee of salvation. Consider the audacity of this. Urban is offering to unlock heaven in exchange for military service. He is creating a new kind of warfare, holy war, where violence becomes not a sin but a sacrament, where killing is not murder but martyrdom's inverse, where conquest becomes pilgrimage. And Europe responds, not with the small mercenary force Alexios had requested, but with something unprecedented, something huge. Tens of thousands take the cross. From every level of society they come, great nobles seeking glory and land, knights seeking redemption and adventure, merchants seeking opportunity, peasants seeking escape from poverty and oppression, younger sons, those unfortunate men in a society of primogeniture who will inherit nothing and must make their own fortunes. Criminals seeking absolution, sincere believers seeking to serve God. Among them are the great lords who will lead the First Crusade. Raymond of Toulouse, perhaps the wealthiest noble in France, who sells or mortgages everything to finance his expedition. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer of fierce capability and fiercer ambition. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, who will become Jerusalem's first Christian ruler. These are capable, ambitious men, medieval warlords of the first rank. But before them, before the organized armies of the nobility, comes something else, something that reveals the depth of religious fervor Urban has unleashed, and the danger of harnessing forces you cannot control. Peter the Hermit is a preacher of extraordinary charisma, a small man, ragged, riding a donkey. He travels through France and Germany, speaking of Jerusalem. His message is simpler and more immediate than Urban's carefully crafted theology. The end times are coming. Christ will return. The faithful must be in Jerusalem when he does, and they must go now. 20,000 people follow him, perhaps more. These are not warriors. They are peasants, urban, poor, women, children, elderly, the desperate and the devoted. They have almost no money, almost no weapons, almost no organization. What they have is faith. They set out in the spring of 1096, months before the official crusade. And as they march eastward through the Rhineland and down the Danube, something terrible happens. The logic is twisted, but to them, coherent. If we are marching thousands of miles to fight unbelievers in the Holy Land, why spare the unbelievers among us? Why protect the Jews in our own cities? The massacres begin. In Speyer, in Worms, in Mainz, in Cologne. Jewish communities that have lived in these cities for generations are attacked. Some bishops try to protect them. Some succeed. Many fail. The death toll reaches into the thousands. It is the first act of the crusading movement, and it is slaughter of innocents. Those who survive the march through Europe reach Constantinople by late summer. Alexios is horrified. This is not what he requested. These are not soldiers but a mob. He ferries them across the Bosporus as quickly as possible, wanting them away from his capital. In October, near a place called Sivadote, the People's Crusade meets the Seljuk Turks in battle. It is not a battle, it is a massacre. The Turks are professional warriors, mobile cavalry, masters of hit-and-run tactics. The Crusaders are untrained, undisciplined, overwhelmed. Within hours, it is over. 20,000 dead or captured. Peter the Hermit, who had gone back to Constantinople for supplies, survives. Almost no one else does. This disaster sets the stage, the grim prologue to what follows. For even as the bones of the People's Crusade bleach in the Anatolian sun, the real crusade is gathering. The armies of the great lords are assembling, and these are forces of a different order entirely. Through 1096 and into 1097, they converge on Constantinople by different routes. Alexios greets them with a mixture of hope and dread. They are larger than he expected, more powerful, harder to control. He extracts oaths of loyalty, promises that lands conquered from the Turks will be returned to Byzantine sovereignty. Some mean it, some do not. Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman, certainly does not. But there is no turning back. In the spring of 1097, the combined Crusader forces, perhaps 60,000 strong, including 20,000 cavalry, cross into Anatolia, and they begin to reveal something that no one, not Alexios, not Urban, perhaps not the Crusaders themselves, fully understood. They can fight. The first test comes at Nicaea, the Turkish capital closest to Constantinople. This is a formidable city with extensive fortifications and a garrison of Turkish warriors. By all rights, the Crusaders, who have no real siege equipment and limited experience in coordinated operations, should fail. But they do not. They blockade the city. They bring up Byzantine siege engines. They cut off relief forces. And after 7 weeks, Nicaea surrenders to Alexios. The Byzantine emperor has arranged a secret capitulation, taking control before the Crusaders can sack the city and claim its wealth. The Crusaders feel cheated, they want plunder, but they accept it. For now, and they march on. Through the Anatolian summer they go. The heat is crushing. Water is scarce. The Turks harry their columns. At a place called Dorileum, the Turkish forces under Kilij Arslan, the Sultan whose father had defeated the Byzantines at Manzikert, attempt to destroy the Crusader army in a set-piece battle. It nearly works. The Turks are more mobile, better coordinated. Their horse archers strike and retreat, strike and retreat. The Crusaders are pushed back, begin to break, but they have advantages the Turks have not fully appreciated. Western heavy cavalry, when it charges, is nearly unstoppable. Western infantry, in disciplined formations, can hold against cavalry attacks. And the Crusaders, whatever their faults, are committed. They have burned their bridges. They have come too far to turn back. They fight with the fury of men who have no retreat. The battle turns. A Crusader force that had been separated rejoins the fight, striking the Turks from an unexpected direction. The Turkish army breaks. The Crusaders win, not through superior tactics, but through sheer determination and tactical flexibility. This is the pattern that will repeat. The Crusaders are often outnumbered. they are in hostile territory. Their supply lines stretch back across thousands of miles. By all strategic logic, they should fail. But they possess something their enemies do not anticipate: absolute commitment, born of religious fervor and desperation. And they face an enemy that, for all its military skill, suffers from a critical weakness. The Muslim world is divided. The great Seljuk Empire that had conquered so much so quickly has already begun to fragment. The death of Sultan Malik Shah in 1092, just 3 years before Urban Sermon, unleashed a succession crisis. The empire has splintered into competing atabegs and emirs, regional strongmen more concerned with fighting each other than coordinating against external threats. Damascus eyes Cairo with suspicion. Aleppo contends with Mosul. The caliphate in Baghdad has religious authority but little actual power. When the Crusaders come, there is no unified response, no coordinated strategy. Each Muslim ruler faces them, or chooses not to face them based on local calculations and immediate interests. Some fight, some negotiate, some simply wait to see what happens. This disunity becomes the Crusaders' greatest advantage. As they push south through Syria, they defeat Muslim forces piecemeal. Antioch falls after an 8-month siege that nearly destroys the Crusader army, but ends in triumph through betrayal, a gate opened by a disgruntled garrison commander. Jerusalem, when they finally reach it in June of 1099, stands isolated, its garrison limited, its walls strong but not impregnable. The siege lasts 5 weeks. Water is scarce, the defenders have poisoned the wells outside the walls. The heat is ferocious, but Genoese ships arrive with supplies and, crucially, timber to build siege towers. On July 15th, 1099, the Crusaders breach the walls. What follows is slaughter. For 2 days, the Crusaders kill Muslims, Jews, men, women, children. The massacre is indiscriminate and terrible. Contemporary accounts, Christian and Muslim alike, describe streets running with blood, bodies piled so high that survivors cannot walk without climbing over corpses. It is one of the great atrocities of the medieval period. When it ends, the Crusaders gather at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site where tradition holds that Christ was buried and resurrected. They weep, they pray. They give thanks for delivering the holy city into their hands. The First Crusade has succeeded. Against all odds, against strategic logic, against the expectations of everyone who witnessed it unfold, the Crusaders hold Jerusalem. And now they must determine what comes next. For conquest, as every empire in history has discovered, is the easy part. Holding what you have taken, building something lasting from the chaos of victory, that is where the real work begins. That is where most conquests fail. The Crusaders stand victorious in a city they have painted with blood, in a land they barely understand, surrounded by enemies they have enraged, dependent on supply lines that stretch across the known world. They have achieved the impossible. Now they must do something even harder. They must survive. There is a moment that comes after every conquest, a moment of reckoning, when the fever of victory fades, and the conquerors must confront the reality of what they have done. The Crusaders faced this moment in the summer of 1099, standing in a Jerusalem they have soaked in blood, and the mathematics are brutal. Count the numbers with me. The Crusader army that took Jerusalem numbered perhaps 15,000 men. Disease, desertion, and battle have reduced it further. Many fulfill their vows and immediately begin the journey home, their pilgrimage complete, their salvation secured. They see no reason to remain. By the time Godfrey of Bouillon accepts leadership of the city, refusing the title of king, calling himself merely defender of the Holy Sepulchre, he commands perhaps 300 knights and 2,000 infantry. 300 knights. To hold a kingdom, now consider the territory they claim. From Edessa in the north to Jerusalem in the south, The Crusaders have carved out four principal states: the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Together, they control a narrow strip of the Levantine coast and its immediate hinterland, perhaps 70,000 square miles. And within this territory live perhaps 400,000 people, the vast majority of them Muslim or Eastern Christian, with substantial Jewish communities in the cities. The Crusaders themselves, the Western Europeans who have conquered this land, number no more than 30,000 souls across all four states, perhaps fewer. They are 1 in 13, 1 in 15, a thin crust of Latin Christians ruling over a sea of people who speak languages they do not understand, practice religions they consider heretical or infidel, and remember quite clearly that these foreigners arrived as conquerors and massacred their way to power. This should not work. By every principle of strategic logic, by every historical precedent, this situation is untenable. A tiny minority cannot hold a hostile majority indefinitely, especially not when surrounded by enemies who outnumber them 100 to 1. The Crusader states should collapse within a generation, swept away by the first concerted Muslim counterattack. They will last 2 centuries. How? How does an impossible situation become a functioning kingdom? How does strategic absurdity transform into strategic reality? The answer lies in one of history's most remarkable experiments in defensive architecture and military organization. The Crusaders will build a machine, a system of stone and steel and faith that multiplies their limited strength through brilliance of design. Begin with the most fundamental question: where do you put your castles? The Crusaders inherit some fortifications from their Byzantine and Arab predecessors, but these are inadequate for their purposes. They need more, many more, and they need them in precisely the right places. For the castles they build will not merely be strongholds, they will be the skeleton of their kingdom, the framework that holds everything together. Look at the placement. Along the eastern frontier, where the Crusader lands meet Muslim territories, massive fortifications arise at strategic choke points. Crac des Chevaliers, the castle of the knights, is positioned to control the gap between the mountains and the sea, blocking the route from the Muslim interior to the coast. Belvoir overlooks the Jordan Valley, watching the approaches from Damascus. Kerak sits astride the main road from Egypt to Syria, able to threaten any army that passes. These are not merely defensive positions, they are offensive weapons. From these castles, Crusader forces can raid Muslim territories, disrupt trade caravans, threaten cities, and retreat to safety behind walls that Muslim forces cannot easily breach. The castle network transforms weakness into strength through strategic geometry, but it is the engineering that astonishes. Stand before Crac des Chevaliers today, yes, it still stands, 900 years later, and you confront something that seems to belong to a later age. The outer wall is 12 feet thick in places. The inner citadel rises on a platform protected by a glacis, a smooth, sloping wall that prevents siege engines from approaching closely and offers no cover to attackers. Multiple defensive lines mean that breaching one wall merely brings attackers into a killing ground commanded by the next. Water cisterns can hold enough for 5 years. Granaries can feed a garrison through long sieges. Everything is designed for one purpose: to allow a small force to hold against a large one indefinitely. The numbers tell the story. A castle like Crac requires perhaps 60 knights and 400 infantry for full garrison. With these 500 men, it can resist attacks by armies numbering in the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. The multiplication of force is extraordinary. 1 man behind these walls equals 10 in the field. 20. The exact calculation depends on the skill of attackers and defenders, but the principle holds: fortification transforms the strategic equation, and the Crusaders build not one such castle, but dozens, scores. a network so dense that no Muslim army can advance without bypassing fortresses that threaten its supply lines and lines of retreat. To truly conquer the Crusader states, you must reduce these castles one by one, a process that can take years, consume armies, and exhaust treasuries. But castles are merely stone, they require men to hold them. And here the Crusaders face their most intractable problem. They do not have enough men, and they cannot get enough men. The journey from Western Europe takes months and risks death by storm, piracy, or disease. Most Crusaders come, fight, fulfill their vows, and go home. The permanent Latin population grows slowly through immigration and natural increase, but never enough to match the strategic requirement. The solution emerges from an unlikely source: monasticism. In 1119, a small group of knights establishes a hospital in Jerusalem to care for pilgrims. They take monastic vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. They become the Knights Hospitaller, the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. Around the same time, another group forms to protect pilgrims traveling to holy sites. They take their headquarters in a building near the Temple Mount and become the Knights Templar, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. These orders solve the manpower crisis through brilliant institutional innovation. They are, at once, monasteries and armies. Their members are monks who fight, soldiers who pray. They take permanent vows, which means they never go home. They are loyal not to any individual lord, not to the King of Jerusalem or the Prince of Antioch, but to their order and, ultimately, to the Pope. They are professional soldiers in an age when most soldiers are feudal levies, farmers who fight part-time, and they are sustained by an economic model that is, in its way, revolutionary. The orders acquire vast landholdings across Europe through donations from the faithful. These estates generate income rents, tithes, agricultural produce that flows eastward to support military operations in the Holy Land. A monastery in France supports knights in Syria. A hospital in England funds a castle in Outremer, as the Crusader states are called literally, the land beyond the sea. This is something new under the sun, an international military organization funded by continental economic networks, operating permanently in a distant theatre, loyal to a supranational authority. It is the medieval equivalent of a multinational defense corporation. And it works. By the middle of the 12th century, the military orders garrison many of the most important castles. Crac de Chevalier is turned over to the Hospitallers, who expand and strengthen it. The Templars hold key fortresses in the north. The King of Jerusalem is relieved of enormous expense maintaining these garrisons while retaining their military benefits. The orders become indispensable to the Crusader state's survival. But stone and steel alone cannot secure a kingdom. The Crusaders must also practice statecraft, and here they reveal a pragmatism that often sits uneasily beside their stated religious mission. Consider the basic reality. The Crusaders must trade. They need grain from the interior, luxury goods for European markets, intelligence about their enemies' movements and intentions. This requires commerce with Muslims, and commerce requires treaties, agreements, safe conduct, the ordinary machinery of medieval diplomacy. So Crusader lords make alliances with Muslim emirs. They pay tribute to avoid attacks. They hire Muslim soldiers, yes, infidels, to fight in their armies when needed. The Kingdom of Jerusalem maintains a sophisticated intelligence network that penetrates Muslim courts. Christian and Muslim merchants move freely through each other's territories during truces. In the markets of Acre and Tyre, you will find Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians, and Latin Christians conducting business with pragmatic indifference to theological differences. The great lady Melisende, who rules Jerusalem from 1131 to 1152, exemplifies this practical approach. She is queen in her own right, not merely a king's wife or regent for a minor son. She commissions Arabic language manuscripts. She maintains cordial relations with Damascus. She understands that survival requires more than military force. It demands political skill, economic integration, and the ability to see enemies as potential partners when circumstances demand. This pragmatism extends to religious tolerance, at least by medieval standards. The Crusaders need their subject populations. Muslim peasants farm the land. Eastern Christian merchants facilitate trade. Jewish physicians serve in court. Mass forced conversions would destroy the economic base and provoke rebellions the Crusaders cannot afford to suppress. So, within limits, there is accommodation. Muslims and Jews pay special taxes, the jizya that Islamic law also imposed on non-Muslims, but are otherwise left to their own affairs. Eastern Christians find the Latin Church's authority irksome but not intolerable. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, from this perspective, is less a pure Crusader state than a hybrid, a place where military occupation gradually transforms into something more complex. Intermarriage occurs between Crusader nobles and local Christian nobility. Children grow up speaking Arabic as well as French. Cultural borrowing flows in both directions. The Crusaders adopt Eastern dress, more practical in the heat, and Eastern customs. They learn from Arab physicians and scientists. They discover that the world is more complicated than the binary of Christian and infidel that inspired their crusade. But this pragmatism has limits, and these limits reveal themselves with terrible clarity in the Second Crusade. The year is 1144. Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, conquers Edessa, the northernmost Crusader state, after a siege. The city's fall shocks Europe. Edessa was the first Crusader conquest and is now the first major loss. Pope Eugenius III calls for a new crusade. Bernard of Clairvaux, perhaps the most influential religious figure in Europe, preaches it with apocalyptic fervor. Kings take the cross: Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. This is, on paper, a more impressive force than the First Crusade. 2 kings, vast armies, clear objectives. It should succeed. It achieves almost nothing. The German army is largely destroyed in Anatolia by Turkish forces. The French army arrives in the Holy Land diminished and demoralized. And then the Crusader leadership makes a strategic decision that defies explanation. They decide to attack Damascus. Damascus, the Muslim city that has, for decades, maintained relatively peaceful relations with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Damascus, whose rulers see the rising power of Zengi and his heirs as a greater threat than the Crusaders. Damascus, which could have been an ally, or at least a neutral party in the inevitable confrontation with the unified Muslim forces of Syria. The Second Crusade besieges Damascus in July of 1148. The siege lasts 4 days. It fails completely. The Crusader army withdraws, having united Muslims against them and achieved nothing. Louis VII goes home. Conrad goes home. The military orders remain, as always, but they now face a more unified enemy. This is what happens when religious objectives override strategic logic. The Crusaders came to fight Muslims, any Muslims. Damascus was Muslim, therefore it should be attacked. The fact that attacking Damascus destroyed a potential alliance handed Zengi's heir Nur ad-Din a powerful propaganda victory and made future Crusader survival more difficult. These considerations were subordinated to the simpler imperative: attack the infidel. The Second Crusade fails because it confuses activity with strategy, religious enthusiasm with political wisdom. It is a lesson the Crusader states will learn, imperfectly and at great cost, over the following decades. Survival requires more than faith. It requires thought, and yet they do survive. The castle network holds. The military orders grow stronger. Trade flourishes. European pilgrims arrive in steady streams, bringing money and occasional reinforcements. The coastal cities, Acre, Tyre, Sidon, Jaffa, become prosperous entrepôts where east meets west. Italian merchants, Venetians, Genoese, Pisans established trading quarters with special privileges, funneling the goods of Asia to European markets and generating customs revenues for the kingdom. By 1150, 2 generations after the First Crusade, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem has achieved something remarkable. It is no longer just a military occupation. It is a functioning state. It mints coins. It promulgates laws, the Assizes of Jerusalem, a sophisticated legal code. It maintains diplomatic relations with both Christian and Muslim powers. It has its own culture, a hybrid of French chivalric traditions and Eastern Mediterranean realities. Children are born here who have never seen France or Germany or Italy. To them, this is not Outremer, the land beyond the sea. This is simply home. They speak French with an accent. They eat Eastern foods. They negotiate with Muslim merchants in Arabic as a matter of course. They are something new, neither purely European nor purely Eastern, but Levantine crusaders, shaped by the land they hold and the compromises required to hold it. But survival is not security. The Crusader states have achieved stability, but it is a fragile stability, maintained by constant vigilance and good fortune. The castle network is formidable but not impenetrable. The military orders are powerful but limited. The pragmatic alliances are useful but unreliable. The entire edifice depends on one crucial condition: that the Muslim world remains divided. For 2 generations, it has been. Emirs fight emirs. Damascus fears Aleppo. Cairo and Baghdad pursue their own interests. The Crusaders have survived not because they were strong enough to defeat unified opposition, but because unified opposition never materialized. But in the north, beyond the frontier castles, in the cities of Mosul and Aleppo, something is changing. A vision is taking form. A strategy is being crafted. A leader is rising who understands what his predecessors did not, that to destroy the Crusader states, you must first unite the Muslim world. His name is Nur ad-Din, and he is patient. There are different kinds of power in this world. There is the power of the sword, immediate, visible, decisive, in the moment. And there is the power of patience, the ability to think in decades rather than seasons, to build systematically toward distant goals, to recognize that some victories cannot be rushed. Nur ad-Din possesses both, but it is the second that makes him truly dangerous. He inherits power in 1146 when his father, Zengi, is assassinated by a slave. Nur ad-Din is 29 years old. He becomes Atabeg of Aleppo, a military governor, theoretically subordinate to the Seljuk Sultan but in practice independent. His father conquered Edessa, striking the first major blow against the Crusader states in a generation. It is a powerful legacy, but it is also incomplete. Look at the map as Nur ad-Din sees it. The Crusader states control the coast, blocking Muslim access to the Mediterranean. But they are narrow, a strip rarely more than 100 miles wide. Behind them, to the east, lies the Muslim heartland, Syria, Iraq, Arabia. Before them, to the south, lies Egypt, immensely wealthy, historically powerful, but currently weak under the Fatimid Caliphate. And between these Muslim territories stand the Crusaders, profiting from division, playing Muslim factions against each other, surviving through the fragmentation of their enemies. Nur ad-Din understands what most of his predecessors did not. The Crusaders cannot be defeated piecemeal. Attacking them directly, city by city, castle by castle, is futile. Their fortifications are too strong. their knights too skilled, their maritime connections to Europe ensure endless reinforcement. To destroy them, you must first unite the Muslim world. You must encircle them. You must make their position strategically untenable. This becomes his life's work. Begin with Syria. When Nur ad-Din inherits Aleppo, Damascus remains independent under its own Atabeg. These two Syrian powers have fought each other for decades. Damascus has, at times, allied with the Crusaders against Aleppo. This division is what kept the Crusader states safe in the north. Nur ad-Din could attack Damascus immediately, his army is strong enough. But he does not. Instead, he wages a different kind of campaign. He positions himself as the champion of jihad holy war against the Crusaders. Every military action he takes against the Crusaders is accompanied by religious rhetoric. He builds madrasas, religious schools that teach not just theology, but the obligation to resist the Christian occupation. He commissions poetry and literature celebrating jihad. He lives simply, conspicuously pious, praying punctually, drinking no alcohol, maintaining no harem, a stark contrast to many Muslim rulers of the era. This is political genius. By framing his ambition in religious terms, Nur ad-Din makes opposition to him appear as opposition to Islam itself. He transforms his territorial expansion from naked conquest into religious duty. And crucially, he makes the Crusaders not his Muslim rivals, the primary enemy. Damascus watches and calculates. The Second Crusade's foolish attack in 1148 demonstrated that Crusader alliances are unreliable and potentially suicidal. Better to align with a Muslim power that promises protection. In 1154, Damascus opens its gates to Nur ad-Din, not through siege, but through negotiation. Syria is unified under one ruler for the first time in generations. The Crusaders now face what they always feared, a unified enemy on their eastern border. The strategic balance shifts. Nur ad-Din controls the interior. He can move forces from Aleppo to Damascus without crossing Crusader territory. He can coordinate attacks. He can wait for his moment. But he still lacks decisive superiority. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, though diminished by the loss of Edessa, still holds strong positions. And there is Egypt. Egypt is the prize. The Nile Valley is perhaps the wealthiest territory in the Mediterranean world. Its agriculture is legendary. The river floods annually, depositing rich silt that produces abundant harvests. Its population is large. Its position, controlling the land route from Asia to Africa, makes it commercially invaluable. Whoever holds Egypt holds the key to regional dominance. But the Fatimid Caliphate that rules Egypt is collapsing. The caliphs are weak, often children or incompetents. Real power rests with viziers, chief ministers who rise and fall through palace coups. The army is unreliable, the government is bankrupt. It is a power vacuum waiting to be filled. Both Nur ad-Din and the Kingdom of Jerusalem recognize this. Through the 1160s, they wage a proxy war in Egypt, each supporting different factions in the Fatimid court, each sending military expeditions to influence events. The Crusaders, led by King Amalric I, invade Egypt 5 times in 6 years. 5 times they withdraw without permanent gains. The campaigns are costly, exhausting, and ultimately futile. Nur ad-Din's approach is more subtle. He sends one of his most capable commanders, a Kurdish officer named Shirkuh, with an army to support a Fatimid faction. Shirkuh brings his nephew, a young man named Yusuf ibn Ayyub. We know him better by his honorific, Salah ad-Din, Saladin. Watch what happens. Shirkuh becomes vizier of Egypt in 1169, but dies within months. Saladin, still in his early 30s, succeeds him. The Fatimid Caliph is a teenager with no power. Saladin is now, in effect, ruler of Egypt, nominally subordinate to Nur ad-Din in Syria, technically serving the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo. It is an impossible position, governor of one caliphate serving the ruler of another, surrounded by political rivals, commanding an army that includes factions loyal to different masters. Saladin should fail. He should be assassinated or overthrown within months, as so many viziers before him were. He does not fail, because Saladin, like Nur ad-Din, understands something essential. Legitimacy matters as much as military force. He cannot simply seize power. He must be invited to hold it. He must make himself indispensable. So Saladin defends Egypt. When the Crusaders and Byzantines launch a joint attack on Damietta in 1169, Saladin repels them. When Fatimid factions plot against him, he outmaneuvers them. When rivals emerge, he either co-opts them or eliminates them with surgical precision. He is patient, capable, and ruthless when necessary. In 1171, Nur ad-Din dies. He is 56 years old. His heir is a child. The Syrian Empire, Nur ad-Din, spent 25 years building immediately, begins to fragment as rival governors assert independence. Saladin makes his move. He marches north from Egypt with an army. Ostensibly, he comes to support Nur ad-Din's heir against the Crusaders. In reality, he is positioning himself to inherit Nur ad-Din's project of unification. It takes him 15 years of careful campaigning, political maneuvering, and strategic patience. He conquers Syria city by city, but he does it carefully, always framing his expansion as necessary for the greater goal of jihad against the Crusaders. When he takes Damascus in 1174, he is welcomed as a liberator. When he conquers Aleppo in 1183 after a long siege, he immediately turns its resources toward confronting the Crusaders. By 1185, Saladin controls Egypt, Syria, parts of Iraq, and territory extending into Arabia. He has encircled the Crusader states, and he has done something even more important. He has united these territories not just militarily but ideologically. He is not merely a conqueror, but the champion of jihad, the defender of Islam, the man who will recapture Jerusalem. Understand what this means. For nearly 90 years, the Crusader states survived because their enemies fought each other as much as they fought the Crusaders. That era is ending. Saladin commands resources that dwarf Crusader capacity. Egypt alone has a population of perhaps 4 million more than 10 times the total Latin population of the Crusader states. His armies number in the tens of thousands. His treasury is full, his position is secure, but he cannot simply march on Jerusalem, not yet, because the Crusader castle network still stands, and it is as formidable as ever. More importantly, Saladin faces a skeptical Muslim world. He has proclaimed jihad, but many Muslims remember previous rulers who made similar proclamations while pursuing personal ambition. Saladin must prove he means it. He must demonstrate results. So he begins to probe Crusader defenses. Raids increase. Small fortresses are besieged. He tests Crusader response times, studies their tactics, identifies weaknesses, and he waits for his opportunity. It comes through Crusader folly. Reginald of Chatillon is a Crusader lord of precisely the wrong temperament for this moment. He holds the fortress of Kerak, which sits astride the route from Egypt to Syria. From this position, he can raid Muslim caravans, and he does so with enthusiasm and no discrimination. He attacks not just military targets but pilgrimage caravans traveling to Mecca. In 1187, he seizes a caravan in which Saladin's sister is traveling. Perhaps, the sources differ on this detail, but it provides Saladin with perfect justification. The treaties between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem include clauses protecting trade and pilgrimage. Reginald has violated them repeatedly. The King of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, is either unable or unwilling to restrain him. Saladin declares that Reginald has broken the truce. He assembles his armies, and he invades. The Crusader leadership faces a decision: defensive or offensive. Do they garrison their castles and wait, forcing Saladin to besiege fortresses he cannot easily take? Or do they assemble their field army and meet him in battle? They choose battle. It is a fatal mistake. The Crusader army that assembles in late June of 1187 is impressive, perhaps 20,000 men, including 1,200 heavy cavalry. This is nearly every available fighting man in the kingdom. They march east from the coastal cities into the Galilee, heading for Tiberias, where Saladin's forces are besieging the citadel. Saladin has prepared the battlefield. He has studied Crusader tactics for years. He knows their strengths: the devastating charge of heavy cavalry, the solid infantry formations, the fighting spirit of the military orders. He knows their weaknesses. They require water in the summer heat, their heavy armor exhausts them, and they fight in tight formations that are vulnerable to archery. So he maneuvers them away from water sources, onto the dry plateau between the Sea of Galilee and Nazareth. The Crusaders march on July 3rd under the summer sun. The heat is crushing. They carry what water they can, but it is not enough. Saladin's light cavalry harasses them constantly, arrows striking, then retreat before the Crusaders can charge. The Muslim forces have access to the springs at Turan. The Crusaders have nothing. By nightfall of July 3rd, the Crusader army camps on a plateau near two hills called the Horns of Hattin. They are desperately thirsty. They are exhausted, and they are surrounded. Saladin's army, perhaps 30,000 strong, encircles them. On the morning of July 4th, 1187, Saladin sets the dry grass afire. The wind carries smoke into the Crusader lines. Then the attack begins. It is not a glorious battle, it is slaughter. The Crusaders are too thirsty to fight effectively. The smoke chokes them. The arrows never stop. When the Crusader cavalry attempts its legendary charge, the Muslim forces simply retreat, refusing decisive engagement, letting the knights exhaust themselves in futile pursuits. By afternoon, it is over. The Crusader army is destroyed. King Guy is captured. Reginald of Chatillon is brought before Saladin, who offers him conversion to Islam or death. Reginald refuses. Saladin executes him personally, the only captive he kills with his own hand. The knights of the military orders, Templars and Hospitallers, are executed en masse. Saladin recognizes they will never be ransomed and will return to fighting if released. They are too dangerous to spare. The true cross, the relic that Crusaders believed contained wood from Christ's crucifixion, which they carried into battle as a talisman, is captured. It disappears from history. No one knows what became of it. Hattin is one of history's decisive battles. In a single day, Saladin has destroyed the Crusader field army. Without soldiers to garrison them, the great castles become isolated positions. Without relief forces, the cities cannot hold. The kingdom of Jerusalem, which has stood for 88 years, is suddenly defenseless. Saladin does not pause. He marches north to Acre, the kingdom's wealthiest port. It surrenders in July. Nablus surrenders. Jaffa surrenders. Sidon, Beirut, Ascalon, one by one, the coastal cities open their gates. Some are taken by assault, but most negotiate surrender. Saladin's terms are generally moderate: payment of ransom, safe conduct to remain in Crusader territory, no massacre. This is strategic as well as merciful. Each city that surrenders peacefully encourages the next to do the same. By September, he stands before Jerusalem. The city's defenses are formidable, the walls are strong, recently reinforced, but the garrison is tiny. Most of the knights died at Hattin. The population is swollen with refugees from conquered territories. Food supplies are limited. Water is adequate but not abundant. The military situation is hopeless. Saladin offers terms: surrender peacefully, pay ransom, and leave unharmed. The commander of the defense, Balian of Ibelin, negotiates. He is a capable man managing an impossible situation. The ransom is set: 10 dinars per man, 5 per woman, 1 per child. Those who can pay may leave. Those who cannot will become slaves. It is a grim calculation, but far better than the massacre that accompanied the First Crusade's conquest 88 years earlier. And Saladin's generosity extends further. He uses his own funds to free many who cannot pay. His brother pays ransoms. So do other Muslim nobles. Thousands leave Jerusalem as free people who might have been enslaved. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin enters Jerusalem. There is no massacre. There is no mass destruction. The city changes hands through negotiation, not slaughter. Saladin orders the Church of the Holy Sepulchre cleansed. He considers it polluted by Christian worship but not destroyed. Christian pilgrims, he declares, may still visit the holy sites under safe conduct. This is strategic brilliance. By showing mercy, Saladin denies the Crusaders a propaganda victory. There will be no tales of atrocities to inflame Europe, no calls for vengeance to motivate new crusades. Instead, there is grudging respect, even among Christians, for Saladin's honorable conduct. He has recaptured Jerusalem and somehow emerged as a figure of admiration even among his enemies. The news reaches Europe slowly. By winter, the full catastrophe is understood. The kingdom of Jerusalem has fallen. The true cross is lost. The holy city is in Muslim hands. Only a few Crusader fortresses hold out Tyre, Tripoli, Antioch, and the great mountain castles like Crac des Chevaliers. Europe will respond. Kings will take the cross. Armies will assemble. The Third Crusade is coming. But Saladin has achieved what seemed impossible. He has reversed nearly a century of Crusader conquest in a single campaign. He has demonstrated that unified Muslim forces can defeat divided Crusaders. He has shown that strategic patience, careful preparation, and brilliant maneuvering can overcome even the most formidable defenses. The Crusader experiment in ruling the Levant has not ended. Fortresses still stand, cities still hold, but the dream of a permanent Christian kingdom centered on Jerusalem is broken. What comes next will be different. A struggle not for conquest but for survival, not for expansion but for clinging to fragments of what was lost. Saladin stands in Jerusalem, victor of the greatest jihad in 10 centuries, and he must know that this is not the end. Europe will not accept this. New crusades will come. The war continues, but the strategic balance has shifted, fundamentally and perhaps irreversibly. The Crusaders will never again hold what they once possessed. The age of Crusader dominance is over. There is a moment in 1201 that captures perfectly how crusading has transformed from strategic enterprise to commercial transaction. Envoys from French nobles stand in Venice, negotiating with the Doge's representatives. They are not discussing theology or Jerusalem's liberation. They are haggling over ship capacity and payment terms like merchants arranging a cargo contract. The crusade has become a business deal, and Venice, the shrewdest merchant republic in Europe, is about to demonstrate what happens when commercial interests capture military expeditions. Let us step back and understand what Venice is in 1200. It is not merely a city but a maritime empire. Its galleys dominate Mediterranean trade. Its merchants maintain colonies from Constantinople to Alexandria. Its wealth exceeds most kingdoms, and its strategic interests lie not in Jerusalem's spiritual significance, but in controlling trade routes and eliminating commercial rivals. The Crusade contract seems straightforward. Venice will build ships to transport 33,500 Crusaders plus their horses and equipment. The price is 85,000 silver marks, roughly twice the annual revenue of the Kingdom of France. In addition, Venice will provide 50 war galleys at its own expense in exchange for half of all conquests. It is an enormous undertaking, committing Venice's entire shipbuilding capacity for 18 months. The Venetians fulfill their part. They construct the fleet transport ships, horse transports, and war galleys, the largest maritime operation yet attempted. By summer of 1202, the ships wait at Venice's wharves, but the Crusaders cannot pay. Of the expected 33,000 Crusaders, only 12,000 arrive in Venice. Many French nobles have taken alternative routes or abandoned the crusade entirely. The Crusaders who do arrive pool their resources and raise 35,000 marks, less than half the contracted amount. Venice is now in crisis. They have invested enormous resources in ships that cannot be fully paid for. The city's economy has been oriented toward this crusade for 2 years. Enrico Dandolo, the Doge, is 90 years old, elected for life in 1192 after a career as diplomat and administrator. He is blind. Accounts vary on whether this resulted from a head injury in Constantinople decades earlier or natural aging, but his strategic vision remains acute. Dandolo proposes a solution. The Crusaders will help Venice reconquer Zara, a Dalmatian coastal city that has defected to Hungary's protection. This military service will compensate for the payment shortfall. Venice gets a rebellious colony back, the Crusaders get their transportation, and the crusade can proceed. The Crusaders agree. Despite Zara being a Christian city under the protection of the King of Hungary, who is himself a Crusader. In November of 1202, the combined Venetian Crusader fleet besieges Zara. The city surrenders after 2 weeks. The Crusaders sack it thoroughly. Pope Innocent III, when he learns of this, is apoplectic. A crusading army has attacked a Christian city. He excommunicates the entire crusade. The Venetians ignore this. Venice has been excommunicated before and survives perfectly well. The Crusaders, after some soul-searching, decide the Pope does not understand their financial situation and continue. Zara should have ended the diversion. The debt is settled, the ships are available, the crusade can proceed to Egypt or the Holy Land. But then Alexios Angelos appears. Alexios is perhaps 25 years old, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II. His uncle, Alexios III, seized power in 1195, blinding Isaac and imprisoning him. Young Alexios escaped and has been traveling European courts seeking support for restoration. He offers the crusade a deal that seems impossibly generous. Restore his father to the Byzantine throne, and he will provide 200,000 silver marks, 10,000 Byzantine troops for the crusade, provisions for the army, and most importantly, reunification of the Eastern and Western churches under papal authority. Consider what this offer means to the various parties. For the Crusaders, it solves all financial problems and provides massive military reinforcement. For the Pope, church union would be his greatest achievement. For Venice, regime change in Constantinople means trade concessions and elimination of commercial obstacles. For Alexios, it is his only path to power. The offer has one problem. It is almost certainly impossible to fulfill. The Byzantine treasury is depleted by decades of mismanagement and territorial losses. The Byzantine population despises the Latin West and would never accept church union. Alexios has no authority to make binding commitments. He is a refugee, not an emperor, but desperation and wishful thinking combine to make the impossible seem merely difficult. In spring of 1203, the crusade sails not to Egypt but to Constantinople. Along the way, They see the magnitude of what they approach. Constantinople is vast beyond anything in Western Europe. Its population exceeds 400,000. Paris has perhaps 100,000, Venice 50,000. Its walls stretch for miles. The Hagia Sophia's dome soars higher than any church in the West. The city's wealth, accumulated over 8 centuries as the Eastern Roman Empire's capital, is legendary. The Crusaders demand Alexios III restore Isaac II and accept young Alexios as co-emperor. Alexios III refuses. The Crusaders attack. The assault on July 17, 1203, demonstrates Venetian naval innovation. They construct wooden towers on their largest ships, making floating siege platforms that can be rowed against the sea walls. Venetian sailors scale these towers onto the walls while Crusader knights force a gate. The dual assault succeeds. Alexios III flees with what treasury he can carry. Isaac II is restored, blind and weakened, with his son as co-emperor Alexios IV. Now the promises must be fulfilled, and reality intrudes. Alexios IV tours Constantinople's treasury and discovers it is nearly empty. Previous emperors have spent or stolen most of it. The 200,000 marks do not exist. He attempts to raise money through taxation and confiscation of church wealth. The population riots. When he tries to impose church union with Rome, violence erupts. Orthodox Greeks consider the Pope a schismatic heretic. Accepting his authority is spiritual treason. The Crusaders, camped outside the city, grow increasingly hostile. They were promised payment. They delivered the service. The Byzantines are welching on the deal. Relations deteriorate through winter. The Crusaders periodically rampage through suburbs. The Byzantines refuse to pay what they do not have. Alexios IV is trapped between Crusader demands and popular fury. In January of 1204, a Byzantine mob storms the palace. They murder Alexios IV and install Alexios V, called Mortzophilos, bushy eyebrows, as emperor. He is a nationalist who repudiates all agreements with the Crusaders and prepares to defend Constantinople against them. The Crusaders now face choices. They can abandon the crusade as a failure and return home with nothing. They can proceed to the Holy Land without the promised Byzantine support, trying to accomplish something with diminished resources. Or they can take Constantinople by force, seizing enough wealth to compensate their efforts, punish Byzantine betrayal. They choose conquest. In March of 1204, Crusaders and Venetians conclude a formal agreement. Constantinople will be sacked and divided 3/4 to the Crusaders, 1/4 to Venice. A new emperor will be elected. If Venetian, the patriarch will be French. If French, the patriarch will be Venetian. It is methodical planning for the destruction of Christendom's greatest city. The assault begins April 9th, 1204. The Crusaders attack by land and sea simultaneously. The sea walls, where Venetian ships attempt the floating tower assault that worked in 1203, resist. Byzantine defenders rain stones and fire on the Venetian ships, driving them back. The land assault makes no progress against the massive Theodosian walls that have defended Constantinople for 1,000 years. April 12th brings renewed assault with greater preparation. This time, the Venetians lash ships together, creating stable platforms. They time their assault for when the wind blows towards shore, helping ships reach the walls. Simultaneously, Crusaders breach a walled-up gate with axes and battering rams. Defenders, facing attack from sea and land, cannot hold everywhere. The walls are breached. What follows is catastrophe. For 3 days, the Crusaders sack Constantinople. They loot, systematically breaking into churches, palaces, homes, warehouses. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, is stripped of its gold and silver. Crusaders steal the bronze horses from the hippodrome. They will grace Venice's San Marco Basilica for 8 centuries. Ancient statues are melted for their metal. Libraries burn. Art treasures are destroyed or stolen. The violence is staggering even by medieval standards. Women are raped in convents and churches. Citizens are murdered for their possessions or merely for being in the way. The Orthodox Patriarch's vestments are stripped from him. Holy relics are stolen and scattered to Western. Churches' relics that will be displayed for centuries as proof of Crusader piety. Contemporary accounts record the plunder's value at 400,000 silver marks divided among Crusaders, and another 400,000 to Venice, though the actual total may exceed this. It is possibly the greatest concentration of wealth looted in medieval history, but the cost is incalculable. The Latin Empire of Constantinople is established with Baldwin of Flanders as emperor. The Byzantine Empire fragments refugees, establish successor states in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus, each claiming to be the legitimate continuation. The Latin Empire holds Constantinople but little else. It is economically devastated, militarily weak, and completely dependent on Venetian naval support. Venice gains enormously. They secure a quarter of Constantinople, including the critical harbour and commercial districts, and establish colonies throughout former Byzantine territories. Venetian merchants now dominate eastern Mediterranean trade with no Byzantine competition. It is strategic triumph for Venice, purchased through Crusader betrayal of Christian unity. The long-term consequences are catastrophic. The Byzantine Empire never recovers its former strength. When it reclaims Constantinople in 1261 under Michael VIII Palaiologos, the city is a shadow of its former greatness. The empire's territories are permanently reduced, its economy shattered, its military capacity broken. This weakness will prove fatal when the Ottoman Turks emerge as the dominant power in Anatolia during the 14th century. The Byzantine Empire that could have resisted Turkish expansion is gone, destroyed not by Muslim conquest but by Christian crusaders. The relationship between Eastern and Western Christianity is poisoned forever. When later Crusades request Byzantine assistance, they are met with bitter refusal. The Orthodox Church remembers Latin treachery, even when Constantinople faces final siege by the Ottomans in 1453. Many Byzantines prefer Turkish conquest to submission to Rome. The Fourth Crusade's sack ensures this, and the crusade itself achieves nothing for the Holy Land. Not a single crusader from this expedition fights in Jerusalem or Egypt. The entire enterprise is diverted to serve Venetian commercial interests and Crusader greed. It is strategic incoherence raised to the level of civilizational disaster. Pope Innocent III, when he learns the full extent of the catastrophe, initially expresses horror. Then, pragmatically, he accepts the fait accompli and lifts the excommunication, hoping to salvage something from the disaster through church union. It never happens. The Orthodox population never accepts Latin religious authority. The Fourth Crusade demonstrates how completely crusading institutions can be captured by interests having nothing to do with their stated purpose. Venice manipulates financial dependency to redirect an entire crusade toward commercial objectives. Crusaders, facing sunk costs and broken promises, choose plunder over principle. Religious authority proves powerless to control events once military forces are committed. Turn now to the Fifth Crusade, which attempts to restore strategic rationality to crusading. It will demonstrate different problems, how religious ideology, when divorced from military reality, produces disaster even when strategic thinking is sound. The Fifth Crusade, proclaimed in 1215, returns to the Egyptian strategy. Attack Egypt, destroy the Ayyubid power base, and Syrian territories become indefensible. It is the strategy Richard Lionheart proposed and the French rejected. It is the strategy military professionals consistently recommend. And it has fundamental logic. Egypt's wealth and population make it the strategic center of Ayyubid power. The Crusades' target is Damietta, a fortified city controlling access to the Nile Delta. Take Damietta, and the road to Cairo lies open. The city is formidably defended, thick walls, strong garrison, and a massive chain stretched across the Nile preventing ship access. A fortified tower sits in the river itself, controlling the chain and providing a platform for artillery to sink approaching vessels. The crusade arrives in May of 1218 with perhaps 30,000 troops, including 5,000 knights. German, Italian, and French contingents come in waves throughout the year. King Andrew of Hungary leads Hungarian forces. The military orders Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights contribute their professional expertise. The siege immediately encounters the river tower problem. Ships cannot pass while the tower stands, but the tower is built on a sandbar in mid-river, surrounded by water and heavily fortified. Muslim defenders rain arrows and fire on any approach. Several attempts to storm it fail with heavy casualties. Then Oliver of Paderborn, a German crusader, designs an innovative siege engine, a floating siege tower built on 2 ships lashed together. The tower rises above the river fort's walls, allowing crusaders to shoot down into it while protected from return fire. In August of 1218, after weeks of construction, the floating fortress approaches the tower. Crusader crossbowmen clear the walls. Soldiers storm the fort. The tower falls. The chain is broken. Ships can now supply the crusade and blockade Damietta from the riverside, but the city's walls still stand, and the garrison resists fiercely. The siege settles into attritional warfare, mining and countermining, assault and repulse, disease and starvation affecting both sides. The Crusaders suffer terribly through winter floods when their camps become swamps. Thousands die from disease. In summer of 1219, the Ayyubid Sultan al-Adil dies, and succession disputes temporarily weaken Muslim response. Al-Kamil, now ruling Egypt, faces threats from his brothers in Syria. The Odysseum, internal Ayyubid divisions mirror the situation that allowed the First Crusade's success. The Crusaders press their advantage. In November of 1219, after 16 months of siege, Damietta surrenders. The Crusaders have achieved the first major conquest in Egypt since Saladin's time. They hold a fortified city with harbour access, a base for further operations. Now they must decide: advance immediately on Cairo or consolidate and wait for reinforcements. Here enters Pelagius Galvani, papal legate and the Crusade's most senior religious authority. Pelagius is not a military commander. He is a cardinal, a churchman whose authority derives from representing the Pope. But papal legates in crusades often hold effective command, as religious authority supersedes military rank. Pelagius will make decisions, and those decisions will destroy the crusade. The military commanders, including John of Brienne, King of Jerusalem, and the masters of the military orders, counsel waiting. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, has taken the cross and promises to join the crusade. His arrival will double their forces. The Nile floods make summer campaigning impossible anyway. Consolidate Damietta, wait for Frederick and the floods to recede, then advance with overwhelming force. Pelagius rejects this counsel. He distrusts John of Brienne, suspecting the king seeks a negotiated settlement rather than total victory. He believes divine providence favors the crusade, and that hesitation shows lack of faith. He wants action, not patience. Al-Kamil, recognizing crusader strength, makes an extraordinary offer in 1220. Return Damietta, and he will cede Jerusalem, most of the former kingdom of Jerusalem, and all the territories lost at Hattin. He will restore the true cross if it can be found. It is nearly everything the Crusades have fought for over a century, achieved through negotiation rather than bloodshed. Pelagius rejects it. His reasons are partly theological. Accepting Muslim terms seems like acknowledging Muslim legitimacy, and partly strategic calculation that military victory will deliver more. He believes Cairo can be taken, and with it all of Egypt. The offer, he declares, is a sign of weakness to be exploited rather than accepted. The military commanders are horrified. John of Brienne argues passionately for accepting. The offer restores the strategic situation to before Hattin, accomplishing the Crusades' stated goals. But Pelagius holds religious authority, and in crusading armies, religious authority often trumps military judgment. The offer is refused. Frederick II does not come. He keeps postponing illness, German political crisis, various excuses. By summer of 1221, it is clear Frederick will not arrive in time for the campaign season. The crusade must choose: advance without him or wait another year. Pelagius orders advance. In July of 1221, the crusade marches from Damietta toward Cairo, with perhaps 30,000 troops. They move up the Nile, ships carrying supplies alongside the marching army. The plan is to reach Cairo before the flood season peaks, besiege the city, and accept its surrender. The advance proceeds initially without major opposition. Al-Kamil's forces retreat, avoiding battle, harassing the Crusaders but not confronting them directly. By late July, the Crusaders reach the apex of the Nile Delta, where the river branches east to Damietta, southeast to Cairo. It is a landscape of canals, irrigation channels, and low-lying agricultural land. And then Al-Kamil springs the trap. He opens dams and irrigation sluices upstream. Water floods the Crusader camp. The ground becomes marsh. The army finds itself trapped between rising water and Muslim forces holding the high ground. Supply ships cannot navigate the flooded terrain. The Crusaders are surrounded by water with nowhere to retreat. For weeks, the army endures increasingly desperate conditions. Food runs out, disease spreads, horses drown or are slaughtered for food. Attempts to retreat through the floods fail. Al-Kamil's forces prevent any escape. By late August, the situation is hopeless. The Crusaders surrender. The terms are humiliating but necessary for survival. Return Damietta, release all Muslim prisoners, sign an 8-year truce, and evacuate Egypt completely. The Fifth Crusade has achieved nothing except demonstrating that religious rigidity and military incompetence produce disaster regardless of initial success. The tragedy is that victory was available through Al-Kamil's offer. Jerusalem, the Crusade's stated objective, was offered without further fighting. Pelagius's rejection of that offer, motivated by belief that faith and determination could overcome strategic reality, instead produced total failure. This disaster reveals a fundamental problem in crusading strategy: the tension between religious objectives and practical necessities. When religious authority supersedes military judgment, when ideology determines strategy rather than conditions on the ground, catastrophe follows. The Fifth Crusade had everything needed for success: adequate forces, initial victories, enemy willing to negotiate, and lost everything through leadership, refusing to accept strategic reality. Frederick II's eventual crusade, beginning in 1228, represents the opposite approach: pure pragmatism divorced from religious considerations. Frederick has postponed crusading for years while consolidating power in Germany and Italy. Pope Gregory IX, exasperated by the delays, excommunicates him in 1227. When Frederick finally embarks in 1228, he does so as an excommunicated crusader, a logical impossibility that perfectly captures crusading's descent into political theatre. Frederick approaches the crusade as diplomatic negotiation rather than military campaign. He corresponds with Al-Kamil, whom he has been exchanging letters with for years. They discuss philosophy. Frederick is genuinely interested in Islamic learning and maintains Muslim scholars at his court. They negotiate as sophisticated rulers pursuing rational interests rather than religious warriors seeking divine vindication. In February of 1229, they conclude the Treaty of Jaffa. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth return to Christian control for 10 years. Muslims retain the Temple Mount with its mosques, the Dome of the Rock, and Al-Aqsa remain under Muslim administration even as the city becomes Christian. Christians can visit Muslim holy sites. Muslims can visit Christian holy sites. It is compromise recognizing that both religions have legitimate claims to the city. Frederick enters Jerusalem in March and crowns himself King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. No priest will perform the ceremony given his excommunicated status, so he crowns himself. He has achieved through negotiation what Crusader armies failed to achieve through decades of warfare. The reaction from religious authorities is hostile. The Pope condemns the treaty because it allows Muslims to retain their holy sites in Jerusalem. The Patriarch of Jerusalem places the city under interdict. No religious services can be performed while Frederick remains. The military orders denounce the treaty as temporary and dependent on Muslim goodwill. Many Crusaders feel cheated of military glory and spiritual merit. Frederick, facing this opposition and needing to return to Italy where the Pope is invading his territories, departs in May. He leaves behind a restored kingdom of Jerusalem, achieved at minimal cost and without bloodshed. It is strategic success, but religious failure. The treaty lasts its 10 years, then lapses when Al-Kamil's successors choose not to renew. Jerusalem returns to Muslim control in 1244. Frederick's crusade demonstrates that diplomatic settlement is possible when both sides recognize mutual interests. But it also shows that such settlements lack the religious legitimacy that sustains crusading institutions. A negotiated Jerusalem inspires no pilgrims, generates no donations, and contradicts the narrative of holy war against infidels. The Crusades' ideological foundations cannot accommodate pragmatic compromise, even when that compromise achieves stated objectives. The final major royal crusade is led by Louis IX of France, later Saint Louis. Louis represents crusading piety in its purest form. He is genuinely devout, motivated by sincere desire to serve God through liberating Jerusalem. He builds churches, supports monasteries, leads austere personal life, and genuinely believes in crusading as spiritual duty. If sincere faith and royal resources could ensure crusading success, Louis would succeed. His first crusade, beginning in 1248, follows the standard Egyptian strategy: land at Damietta, march to Cairo, destroy Ayyubid power. Louis prepares thoroughly, gathering supplies, negotiating with Italian cities for transport, assembling perhaps 15,000 troops, including 2,500 knights. It is smaller than previous crusades, but well organized and professionally led. The crusade lands at Damietta in June of 1249. The city, remembering the horrors of previous sieges, barely resists. The garrison abandons it almost immediately. Louis takes Damietta with minimal fighting, an auspicious beginning suggesting divine favor. Then Louis waits. The Nile flood season makes summer campaigning impossible. He also waits for his brother Alphonse of Poitiers, who is bringing reinforcements from France. The delay stretches to 6 months. The Crusaders occupy Damietta, fortify it, and prepare for the advance to Cairo. In December, the march begins. The crusade moves up the Nile with perhaps 15,000 men. The Ayyubid response is commanded by the Mamluk slave soldiers who form Egypt's military elite. These are professional warriors, many of Turkic or Circassian origin, who have been trained from childhood for warfare. They are highly disciplined, expertly trained, and absolutely loyal to their commanders. At Mansoura, a fortified city on the route to Cairo, the crusade encounters these Mamluks in battle. Louis's brother Robert of Artois leads the vanguard. Against advice, he charges directly into Mansoura when he finds the gates open, not recognizing it is a trap. The Templars follow, committed by honor to support the charge. The Crusaders penetrate deep into the city's narrow streets. Then the Mamluks spring the ambush. They attack from alleys and rooftops, trapping the Crusaders in the confined space where heavy cavalry cannot maneuver. Robert of Artois is killed. William of Salisbury, the Templar Grand Master, falls. Most of the vanguard is annihilated. It is tactical disaster born from tactical recklessness. Louis holds the main army together and establishes a fortified camp near Mansoura, but the strategic situation deteriorates rapidly. The Mamluks control supply lines, intercepting provision ships coming from Damietta. They harass the Crusader camp constantly, preventing rest or organization. Disease spreads: dysentery, typhoid, and other infections that medieval armies could not treat. By March of 1250, the crusade is trapped. Food is exhausted. Perhaps a quarter of the army is too sick to fight. Retreat becomes necessary. On April 5th, the crusade begins withdrawing toward Damietta. It is less retreat than rout. The Mamluks pursue relentlessly, attacking the retreating columns, capturing stragglers. Louis himself falls ill with dysentery, barely able to remain on his horse. On April 6th, the crusade surrenders. Louis is captured, along with thousands of his men. It is catastrophic defeat: a king of France taken prisoner, his army destroyed, his crusade in ruins. The ransom is staggering: 400,000 livres. Tournoi for Louis and the nobles, plus return of Damietta. It takes weeks to gather such wealth. Louis's queen, Marguerite of Provence, negotiates from Damietta, showing remarkable capability in desperate circumstances. By May, the ransom is paid, the prisoners released, and Louis evacuates Egypt. But Louis does not return to France. He remains in the Holy Land for 4 years, fortifying Crusader cities, negotiating with Muslim neighbors, and working to strengthen the Crusader states. He uses his personal wealth to ransom ordinary Crusaders who cannot afford their freedom. He builds fortifications at Acre, Caesarea, Jaffa, and Sidon. His piety and dedication earn respect even from Muslim contemporaries, but he cannot reverse strategic reality. When he finally returns to France in 1254, the Crusader states are no stronger than when he arrived. Louis's Second Crusade, launched in 1270 when he is 55 years old, targets Tunis in North Africa. The strategic logic is unclear. Some accounts claim he believed the Tunisian emir might convert to Christianity. Others suggest he planned to use Tunis as a base for attacking Egypt. Neither explanation makes strategic sense. Tunis is far from the Holy Land, the emir shows no interest in conversion, and North Africa offers no strategic advantage for Levantine campaigns. The crusade reaches Tunis in July of 1270 and establishes camp outside the city. Then disease strikes. The summer heat, inadequate sanitation, and contaminated water create perfect conditions for epidemic. Dysentery and typhoid spread through the camp. Louis's son John Tristan dies. Louis himself falls ill in August. On August 25th, 1270, Louis dies in his tent. His last words reportedly are, "Jerusalem," the city he tried twice to reach but never saw. His death effectively ends the crusade. His son Philip III negotiates a treaty with Tunis that accomplishes nothing except allowing the army to depart. The last crusade, led by a major European monarch, ends with the king dead of disease, having achieved nothing. These later crusades, the fourth through Louis's campaigns, demonstrate systematic strategic incoherence. The Fourth Crusade serves Venetian commercial interests rather than crusading objectives. The Fifth Crusade sacrifices victory through religious rigidity. Frederick's crusade succeeds diplomatically, but is rejected for insufficient piety. Louis's crusades demonstrate that sincere devotion cannot substitute for strategic competence. The pattern reveals crusading's fundamental problem. The institutions cannot reconcile religious ideology with strategic necessity. When commercial interests, papal politics, or personal piety determine strategy rather than military reality, disaster follows. The movement that began with sophisticated strategic calculation, Urban's redirection of European violence, Alexios's appeal for controlled mercenary support, has devolved into enterprises that consistently fail to achieve their stated objectives while producing catastrophic side effects. And in the Holy Land, the Crusader states that survive do so not because of these crusades but despite them. They endure through the institutions developed in the 12th century. Fortress networks, military order garrisons, Italian naval support, and pragmatic accommodation with Muslim neighbours. The later crusades drain resources without providing lasting benefit, disrupting the delicate balance that allows crusader survival. But survival is not indefinite. The strategic environment is shifting, new powers are emerging, and the crusader states, weakened by a century of attritional warfare and unsupported by effective crusading, are approaching their final crisis. Picture the year 1258. In the Crusader fortress of Acre, nobles and merchants go about their business, negotiating trade contracts, hearing legal cases, planning the harvest from their inland estates. The city bustles with Italian merchants, Templar bankers, and pilgrims arriving by ship. Life continues much as it has for decades. The Crusader states have survived Hattin, weathered Saladin, and endured a century of attritional warfare. They have learned to persist. 4,000 miles to the east, something unimaginable is occurring. The Mongol army of Hulagu Khan surrounds Baghdad. For 5 centuries, since the Abbasid Caliphate's founding in 750, Baghdad has been Islam's symbolic center, the city of peace, home to perhaps 1 million people, repository of the greatest libraries in the world. Now, Mongol siege engines batter its walls. The defenders cannot comprehend what faces them. The Mongols have conquered from China to Eastern Europe, destroying kingdoms and empires with methodical efficiency. They do not negotiate unless it serves strategic purpose. They do not show mercy unless it encourages future surrender. They are conquest systematized, warfare elevated to administrative process. On February 10th, 1258, Baghdad falls. What follows exceeds even the sack of Constantinople in barbarity. For a week, the Mongols systematically destroy the city. Libraries burn, centuries of Islamic scholarship consumed in flames. The House of Wisdom, where scholars translated Greek philosophy and advanced mathematics and astronomy, is demolished. The Grand Library's books are thrown into the Tigris in such quantities that, according to chronicles, the river runs black with ink. The Caliph al-Mustasim is executed. Accounts vary on the method, but the result is certain. The Abbasid Caliphate, which has survived political decline and territorial losses, which outlasted the Umayyads and resisted the Fatimids, ends absolutely. There is no successor, no continuation. The institution simply ceases to exist. The death toll is staggering. Mongol policy is deliberate. Systematic massacre to terrorize future opponents into surrender. Contemporary estimates range from 200,000 to 1 million dead. The entire population of Baghdad essentially eliminated. Whether these numbers are precise or exaggerated, the scale is unprecedented. The Crusaders in Acre, when news reaches them months later, are uncertain how to respond. On one hand, Baghdad's destruction eliminates a symbolic center of Muslim power. On the other hand, these Mongols clearly represent something beyond normal warfare. Reports speak of armies hundreds of thousands strong, of cities destroyed completely, of terror that breaks resistance before armies even arrive. Some crusaders imagine alliance. The Mongols are not Muslim, they follow shamanistic traditions or, increasingly, are converting to Buddhism or Nestorian Christianity. Surely they are potential allies against Islam. Envoys are sent. Letters are written. The Crusaders imagine that sharing enemies creates common cause. This is profound strategic miscalculation. The Mongols are not interested in religious alliances. They seek universal conquest. Everyone submits or is destroyed. Religion is irrelevant. The Nestorian Christians in Mongol ranks are conquered peoples who now serve their conquerors, not free allies pursuing shared objectives. The Crusaders are merely obstacles the Mongols have not yet reached. Hulagu's campaign continues westward. In 1260, he takes Aleppo. In 1260, he takes Damascus. The great Syrian cities that resisted Crusaders for centuries fall to Mongol forces in weeks. The speed is shocking not because Mongol armies are overwhelmingly large, but because their reputation precedes them. Cities surrender rather than face destruction. Resistance seems futile against an enemy that has destroyed Baghdad. The Crusader states watch Syrian conquest with dread mixed with opportunism. Some lords make accommodation with advancing Mongols. Bohemond VI of Antioch actually allies with them, providing supplies and intelligence in exchange for Mongol protection. It is pragmatism taken to its logical extreme. If you cannot resist, collaborate. Then, in September of 1260, everything changes. A Mongol scouting force advances into Palestine, approaching the Crusader kingdom. At Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, they encounter a Mamluk army from Egypt. The Mamluks are slave soldiers who have seized power in Egypt following Louis IX's crusade. These are not administrators or politicians elevated to military command. They are professional warriors who have eliminated their nominal masters and rule through military competence. Their sultan, Qutuz, is a Mamluk who fought his way to power. His greatest general, Baibars, is perhaps the most capable military commander of the 13th century. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluks defeat the Mongols decisively. It is not a skirmish but a major engagement that shatters Mongol invincibility. The Mongol force is destroyed. The survivors retreat. For the first time since their expansion began decades earlier, the Mongols have been stopped. The victory's strategic implications are enormous. The Mongol advance into the Middle East halts. Hulagu withdraws to Persia, partly because of the defeat, partly because of succession crisis following the Great Khan's death in China. The Mongol threat recedes. The Islamic world survives. But the Mamluks' victory has consequences the Crusaders do not immediately understand. The Mamluks have proven themselves as Islam's defenders, stopping an enemy that destroyed Baghdad and conquered Syria. This gives them enormous prestige and legitimacy. More importantly, it gives them confidence. If they can defeat the Mongols, what challenge do the declining Crusader states present? Within months of Ain Jalut, Baibars murders Sultan Qutuz and seizes power. It is brutal pragmatism. Qutuz was useful for legitimizing Mamluk rule through military victory. But Baibars is more capable and more ruthless. From 1260 to 1277, Baibars will systematically dismantle Crusader presence in the Holy Land. Baibars is a strategic thinker of the First Order. He understands that Crusader power rests on three foundations: fortresses that control territory, Italian naval power that provides reinforcement, and divisions among Muslim neighbors that prevent unified opposition. He will systematically attack all three. His first campaigns target isolated Crusader fortresses. Caesarea falls in 1265. Arsuf falls in 1265. Haifa falls in 1265. These are not the great castles like Crac des Chevaliers, but secondary fortifications that support the defensive network. Each conquest reduces Crusader territory, eliminates garrison forces, and demonstrates Mamluk capability. Baibars innovates in siege warfare. He brings massive siege engines, trebuchets that hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds, mangonels that can fire multiple projectiles rapidly, and mining equipment to undermine walls. He imports specialists from across his territories, engineers who understand fortress design, miners experienced in undermining fortifications, and artillerists who can accurately target weak points. More importantly, he has patience. Medieval sieges often failed because besieging armies could not maintain position, supplies ran out, disease struck, or military necessity elsewhere demanded the army's presence. Baibars has the resources to sustain extended sieges and the strategic vision to recognize that systematic fortress reduction serves long-term objectives even when individual sieges are costly. In 1266, he attacks the Templar fortress of Safed in Galilee. The fortress is formidably defended, massive walls, strategic position on a mountain, garrison of Templar knights and Syrian Christians. Baibars besieges it through summer heat, maintaining pressure despite the garrison's determined resistance. He offers terms: the garrison can surrender and depart with their lives and possessions. The defenders eventually accept. They open the gates and begin evacuating. Baibars then violates the terms completely. He massacres the entire garrison. It is calculated terror. Future garrisons will know that Baibars' promises cannot be trusted, but they will also know that resistance leads to certain death, while surrender at least offers the chance of mercy. The psychological impact is devastating. His campaigns continue relentlessly. Jaffa falls in 1268. The Templar fortress of Beaufort falls after extended siege. In 1271, Baibars achieves perhaps his greatest victory: the conquest of Crac des Chevaliers. Crac des Chevaliers is the greatest Crusader fortress, perhaps the greatest castle ever built. Its concentric walls, overlapping fields of fire, and strategic position have made it impregnable for over a century. Hospitaller knights have held it against every assault. It is the symbol of Crusader defensive genius, the fortress that cannot fall. Baibars besieges it in March of 1271 with overwhelming force. He brings siege engines in unprecedented numbers, positions them to batter walls from multiple angles, and maintains continuous assault. The garrison, perhaps 2,000 defenders including 60 Hospitaller knights, resists desperately. But Baibars has learned from previous sieges. He targets weak points methodically, rotates assault forces to maintain pressure, and accepts high casualties, knowing he can replace losses while the defenders cannot. By April, sections of the outer wall are breached. The garrison withdraws to the inner citadel, still defensible but now isolated. Baibars offers terms surrender and the garrison may depart safely. He even produces a forged letter supposedly from the Hospitaller Grand Master, ordering the fortress's surrender. Whether the garrison believes the forgery or simply recognizes the hopeless situation, they accept. In April of 1271, they evacuate. Crac des Chevaliers. This time, Baibars honors the terms. The garrison departs unmolested. He has learned that occasionally showing mercy encourages future surrenders. The strategic impact is enormous. If Crac des Chevaliers can fall, no Crusader fortress is impregnable. The defensive system that sustained Crusader presence for a century has been broken. The Principality of Antioch faces particular pressure. In 1268, Baibars captures Antioch itself in a sudden assault that takes the city by surprise. The massacre that follows is deliberate terror. Nearly the entire population is killed or enslaved. Contemporary chronicles describe streets choked with bodies, thousands killed in churches where they sought sanctuary. Baybars writes to Bohemond VI, who is absent during the attack, describing the destruction in graphic detail. It is psychological warfare, ensuring that everyone knows what resistance brings. The county of Tripoli barely survives. Reduced to the city of Tripoli itself and a few nearby fortresses, it exists only because Baybars focuses his attention elsewhere. The kingdom of Jerusalem shrinks steadily, losing inland territories and fortresses until Crusader presence is reduced to a coastal strip. Throughout these campaigns, the Crusader states appealed desperately to Europe for assistance. Letters describe the catastrophic situation, the fortress losses, the Mamluk threat, but Europe's response is minimal. Louis IX's disastrous Second Crusade in 1270 demonstrates that royal enthusiasm has evaporated. Smaller expeditions arrive a few hundred knights, some infantry, but nothing approaching the numbers needed to reverse the strategic situation. The fundamental problem is that European political will has exhausted itself. 2 centuries of crusading have produced limited results at enormous cost. The Fourth Crusade's disaster, the Fifth Crusade's failure, Frederick's problematic success, Louis's catastrophes all demonstrate that crusading cannot achieve permanent victories. European rulers face pressing concerns closer to home: wars between France and England, the Holy Roman Empire's Italian conflicts, succession disputes, and dynastic struggles. The Holy Land is distant, the prospects of success dim, and the costs prohibitive. The Italian maritime republics continue providing naval support, but increasingly for commercial rather than religious reasons. Venetian and Genoese merchants trade with Mamluk Egypt, often shipping war materials that will be used against Crusader fortresses. When the papacy condemns this trade, the merchants ignore the condemnation. Profit supersedes piety. The military orders remain the most effective fighting forces, but they are overstretched. Templar and Hospitaller fortresses are besieged simultaneously, forcing them to choose which to reinforce. Their European estates still generate revenue, but funds take months to transfer, and by the time reinforcements arrive, fortresses have often fallen. The orders also suffer from strategic disputes. Should they focus on defending remaining territories or attempt offensive operations to reclaim lost ground? Without unified strategy, they respond to crises reactively. In 1277, Baybars dies, possibly from poisoned Kumi's fermented mare's milk. His death does not halt Mamluk expansion, merely pauses it temporarily during succession disputes. His successor, Qalawun, continues the systematic conquest with equal effectiveness. Qalawun brings innovation to Mamluk strategy. He recognizes that direct assault on remaining Crusader cities is costly. Acre, Tyre, and Sidon are strongly fortified and supplied by sea. Instead, he focuses on eliminating their economic base. He raids agricultural lands, destroys mills and irrigation systems, and makes inland territories economically worthless. The Crusader cities become isolated ports with no productive hinterland, dependent entirely on imported food. He also pursues diplomatic strategy. He makes treaties with some Crusader lords while attacking others, preventing unified resistance. He offers trade agreements to Italian merchants, ensuring they have incentive to maintain commercial relations rather than supporting military resistance. He cultivates intelligence networks within Crusader territories, bribing officials and maintaining informants who provide information on defenses and internal disputes. The Crusader response to this systematic pressure is fragmented and ineffective. The Kingdom of Jerusalem lacks strong central authority, kings are weak, noble families feud, and Italian merchant colonies pursue independent policies. The military orders, the most effective military forces cannot cooperate effectively. Templars and Hospitallers compete for resources and influence rather than coordinating strategy. In 1287, Calawun makes a 10-year truce with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It is strategic calculation. He needs time to consolidate territories, reorganize administration, and prepare for final campaigns. The Crusaders need respite desperately and accept gratefully, but the truce only delays the inevitable. In 1289, Italian Crusaders newly arrived at Acre riot and massacre Muslim merchants in the city. It is pointless violence born from religious fervor and complete ignorance of strategic reality. Calawun demands justice. The perpetrators must be surrendered for punishment. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, unable or unwilling to surrender Christian crusaders to Muslim justice, refuses. Calawun declares the truce violated and prepares to attack Acre. He assembles a massive army, perhaps 60,000 troops, though medieval numbers are always uncertain. He gathers siege engines in unprecedented numbers. He mobilizes resources from across the Mamluk Sultanate. Acre will not merely be besieged, but systematically destroyed. In November of 1290, Calawun dies before the campaign launches. But his son, Al-Ashraf Khalil, inherits both the throne and the strategic plan. In April of 1291, the Mamluk army surrounds Acre. Acre is the Crusader kingdom's greatest city. Its population exceeds 30,000 merchants, craftsmen, soldiers, refugees from fallen territories. Its fortifications are formidable. Double walls, towers every 50 yards, a citadel within the city, and harbour protected by chains and towers. The garrison includes Templar and Hospitaller knights, knights from the kingdom, and Italian mercenaries. Perhaps 15,000 fighting men defend the city. But Al-Ashraf Khalil has overwhelming force. His siege engines accounts mention 92 major trebuchets, plus countless smaller machines batter the walls continuously. Mining operations tunnel under towers, packing the tunnels with timber that when burned collapses sections of wall. Assault forces attack breaches immediately, preventing repairs. The siege is industrial in scale, organized with administrative efficiency that previous Muslim campaigns lacked. The defenders resist desperately. The military orders fight with professional skill and suicidal courage. Civilians participate in defense, carrying stones and boiling oil to the walls, helping repair breaches. Italian ships bring some supplies and reinforcements through Mamluk blockade attempts, but the disparity in forces is overwhelming. By mid-May, sections of the outer wall have fallen. Fighting moves into the city streets. The Mamluks push forward systematically, taking each quarter through bloody close combat. The defenders retreat to the inner citadel and harbour fortifications. On May 18th, 1291, organised resistance collapses. The garrison attempts to evacuate by ship, but most are killed in the chaos. The Templar master dies fighting in the tower that bears the order's name. The city falls. Al-Ashraf Khalil orders systematic destruction. Acre's fortifications are demolished, walls pulled down, towers collapsed, harbour facilities destroyed. The city that has been Crusader presence's centre for a century is reduced to ruins. The message is clear. Crusaders will not hold this territory again. The remaining Crusader cities fall rapidly. Tyre is abandoned in May without siege. The garrison recognizes that defense is impossible without Acre's support and evacuates. Sidon falls in June after brief siege. Beirut falls in July. Haifa falls in July. The Templar stronghold of Tortosa on the Syrian coast is abandoned in August. The Hospitaller fortress of Margat, one of the strongest castles, is evacuated without siege in August. By August of 1291, exactly 200 years after the First Crusade began with the Council of Clermont, Crusader presence in mainland Syria and Palestine has been eliminated completely. A few offshore fortresses remain. The Templars hold the island fortress of Arwad until 1302. The Hospitallers control roads, but these are strategic footholds for possible future campaigns, not territories that can project power onto the mainland. The Kingdom of Cyprus, conquered by Richard Lionheart in 1191, survives as a Crusader state until 1571, when the Ottomans conquer it. But Cyprus is a Mediterranean island, not part of the Holy Land. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, the County of Edessa, all are gone. The Crusader presence that once stretched from Edessa to the Red Sea is extinct. Consider what this means. For 2 centuries, European Christians have poured resources into defending the Holy Land. Tens of thousands have died from battle, disease, shipwreck, and starvation. Kings have bankrupted their treasuries. Generations of nobles have spent their lives fighting in distant lands. The papacy has invested enormous political capital. Italian merchants have built commercial empires on crusading logistics. And in the end, it accomplishes nothing permanent. The Crusaders are expelled completely. Jerusalem is Muslim and will remain so until British conquest in 1917, over 6 centuries in the future. The strategic situation returns essentially to what it was before the First Crusade, except that Christian-Muslim relations are permanently poisoned by 2 centuries of warfare. Why did the Crusader states fall? The strategic analysis reveals multiple factors operating simultaneously. First, fundamental demographic weakness. The Crusader states never achieved sustainable population. European immigration never reached levels that could produce armies matching Muslim opponents. Every war attrited forces that could not be replaced locally. Over 2 centuries, this attrition accumulated into irreversible weakness. Second, economic inadequacy. The Crusader territories never generated wealth sufficient to sustain permanent warfare. They depended on European subsidies, Italian commerce, and agricultural productivity constantly disrupted by warfare. As European willingness to subsidize the enterprise declined, economic foundations crumbled. Third, geographic vulnerability. The Crusader states occupied a narrow coastal strip surrounded by hostile territories. Their supply lines stretched thousands of miles to Europe. Every fortress, no matter how strong, could be besieged and isolated. The defensive system that worked against divided opponents failed when facing unified, resourced opposition. Fourth, strategic exhaustion of Europe. 2 centuries of crusading had depleted European enthusiasm and revealed the enterprise's limitations. After multiple failed crusades, catastrophic defeats, and enormous costs, European rulers and populations lost faith that permanent success was achievable. When the final crisis came, reinforcements were inadequate. Fifth, Mamluk military superiority. The Mamluks were professional warriors with institutional continuity, sophisticated siege capabilities, and resources exceeding Crusader capacity. They could sustain campaigns that Crusaders could not match. They learned from failures and adapted tactics. They were, ultimately, simply better at warfare. The fall of Acre and the final Crusader fortresses is not sudden collapse, but culmination of long-term strategic trends. The Crusader states survived as long as Muslim opponents remained divided and European support continued. When those conditions changed, when Mamluks unified Egyptian and Syrian territories and European support declined, the end came rapidly, but inevitably. In Europe, the reaction to Acre's fall is shock, but not mobilization. There are calls for new crusades, but they generate minimal response. The papacy tries to organize expeditions, but rulers plead other priorities. The military orders relocate their headquarters, Templars to Cyprus, Hospitallers, eventually to Rhodes, but they cannot reverse the loss. The temple's fate is particularly tragic. In 1307, King Philip IV of France arrests the entire Templar order in his kingdom on charges of heresy. The accusations are almost certainly fabricated. Philip owes the Templars enormous debts and covets their wealth. Under torture, Templars confess to whatever their interrogators demand. In 1312, Pope Clement V dissolves the order. The last Templar Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, is burned at the stake in 1314. The Hospitallers survive by adapting. They become a naval power, operating from Rhodes and later Malta, conducting warfare against Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean. They remain militarily active until 1798, when Napoleon conquers Malta. But they are no longer crusaders in the Holy Land. They are a Mediterranean naval force, descendants of an institution that once defended Jerusalem. The Crusader states are gone. The 2-century attempt to establish permanent Christian presence in the Holy Land has failed completely. The strategic enterprise that began with such promise in 1099, that survived catastrophe at Hattin and rebuilt afterward, that developed sophisticated defensive systems and innovative institutions, has ended in total expulsion. The Mamluks have achieved what Saladin could not: complete elimination of Crusader territorial presence. They have demonstrated that unified Muslim power, professionally organized and adequately resourced, can systematically dismantle Crusader conquests, regardless of fortress strength or military order expertise. The endgame of the Crusades is not glorious last stand, but systematic eviction, fortresses falling one by one, cities evacuated, garrisons overwhelmed, and finally, complete absence where once Christian kingdoms ruled. It is strategic collapse in slow motion, inevitable once the conditions that enabled Crusader survival changed, and unstoppable once Mamluk conquest momentum built. The Holy Land will not see major Christian military presence again until the First World War, when British forces conquer Palestine from the Ottoman Empire in 1917, over 6 centuries in the future. The crusading era has ended, not with dramatic finality, but with systematic elimination of every territorial foothold. What remains is legacy, political, cultural, military, and religious consequences that will shape centuries to come. Those legacies, and what the Crusades ultimately meant, form the final consideration of this long and bloody chapter of medieval history. Stand in Venice's Piazza San Marco today, and you will see 4 bronze horses adorning the basilica's facade. They are magnificent ancient Greek sculptures, cast perhaps in the 4th century before Christ, brought to Rome, later moved to Constantinople's Hippodrome. In 1204, Crusaders stole them during the sack of Constantinople. They have graced Venice ever since, except for brief periods when conquerors Napoleon, the Austrians, temporarily removed them. These horses are not merely art, they are legacy made visible. They represent wealth extracted through crusading, commercial empire built on military expeditions, and cultural treasures redistributed through conquest. They embody what crusading became and what it accomplished beyond its stated objectives. The Crusades failed in their primary purpose. Jerusalem is not Christian. The Holy Land is not controlled by European kingdoms. The 2-century enterprise to establish permanent Christian presence collapsed completely. By this measure, the measure proclaimed by popes and preached by crusaders, the movement failed absolutely. Yet the Crusades transformed medieval civilization in ways their participants never imagined. The consequences: strategic, economic, political, military, and cultural echo through centuries. Understanding these legacies requires looking beyond the stated objectives to the actual results, intended and unintended, that reshaped the medieval world and influenced modernity. Begin with the most obvious beneficiaries, the Italian maritime republics. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa emerge from the crusading era as Mediterranean superpowers. Their wealth and influence exceed most kingdoms. How did merchant cities become great powers? Through crusading. The Crusades required maritime transport on unprecedented scale. Italian cities possessed the ships, the navigational expertise, and the commercial networks. They charged enormous fees for transport. Recall the Fourth Crusade's 85,000 mark contract with Venice, but they gained far more than transport fees. They acquired colonies throughout the eastern Mediterranean, trade privileges in Crusader cities, and monopolies on valuable commodities. Venice illustrates this transformation perfectly. In 1000, Venice is a modest maritime city, important but not dominant. By 1300, Venice controls a colonial empire, quarters in every major eastern Mediterranean port, Cyprus and Crete as Venetian territories, naval supremacy in the Adriatic and beyond. The wealth this generates funds the magnificent architecture, the Doge's Palace, San Marco's splendor, the palazzos lining the Grand Canal. Venice becomes La Serenissima, the most serene republic, a superpower that will endure until 1797. Genoa and Pisa follow similar trajectories. Genoese colonies dot Mediterranean coasts. Their merchants dominate Black Sea trade after establishing colonies in Crimea. Pisa controls Corsica and Sardinian territories. The rivalry between these maritime republics shapes Mediterranean politics for centuries. They fight each other as often as they fight Muslims, their colonial disputes dragging Crusader states into conflicts having nothing to do with holy war. The Crusades accelerate European commercial development fundamentally. European merchants gain direct access to Eastern goods, spices, silk, dyes, and luxury textiles that previously came through multiple intermediaries. This direct trade increases profit margins and stimulates demand. Banking develops to finance crusading expeditions and manage international transactions. The Templars pioneer banking services, but Italian merchants soon surpass them, creating financial instruments, letters of credit, bills of exchange that enable commerce across vast distances. Agricultural innovations flow from east to west. Crusaders encounter crops unknown in Europe: rice, sugarcane, citrus fruits, new varieties of wheat. They bring these back, transforming European agriculture. Sugar cultivation spreads to Mediterranean islands, creating industries that will later be transplanted to the Atlantic islands and eventually the Americas, with catastrophic consequences for enslaved populations. But the immediate medieval impact is economic diversification and increased agricultural productivity. The Italian Renaissance owes significant debt to crusading wealth. The capital accumulated through Eastern trade funds, artistic patronage, architectural projects, and intellectual pursuits. The manuscripts and knowledge that flow into Italy from the East Greek philosophy, Islamic mathematics and astronomy, medical texts enrich European scholarship. When Constantinople falls to the Ottomans in 1453, Greek scholars flee to Italy, bringing libraries and knowledge that fuel humanist scholarship. But this process began centuries earlier through crusade-facilitated contacts. Turn now to military consequences. For crusading transforms European warfare fundamentally. Castle architecture undergoes revolution. Europeans encounter Byzantine and Muslim fortifications far more sophisticated than their own. They see concentric walls, overlapping fields of fire, sophisticated water management, and defensive designs refined over centuries. They bring these innovations home. Compare castles built before the Crusades with those built after. Pre-Crusade European castles are often simple motte and bailey earthworks topped with wooden palisades or basic stone keeps. Post-Crusade castles display Byzantine influence. concentric walls creating multiple defensive lines, round towers replacing square towers to eliminate blind spots, sophisticated gatehouses with multiple portcullises and murder holes, Edward I's Welsh castles. Conwy, Harlech, Caernarfon, built in the late 1300s, directly apply lessons from Crusader fortresses. They are Crac des Chevaliers, transplanted to Wales. Siege warfare advances through necessity. The Crusades involve more sustained sieges than any previous medieval warfare. Siege engines improve, trebuchets become more accurate and powerful, mining techniques become sophisticated, and countermining develops to detect and prevent enemy tunneling. Naval warfare evolves, as Italian galleys develop tactics for transporting armies, supporting coastal operations. Military organization becomes more professional. The military orders demonstrate that permanent military institutions with consistent training, institutional memory, and dedicated focus achieve results that feudal levies cannot match. European kingdoms begin developing standing forces, not yet full-time professional armies, but permanent corps around which temporary forces can be organized. The Mamluks provide the ultimate example. Slave soldiers trained from childhood, loyal to the institution rather than individual lords, constitute a military force that defeats every opponent, including the Mongols. The Crusades also demonstrate logistics' strategic importance. Moving armies thousands of miles, sustaining them for years, and maintaining supply lines through hostile territory requires organizational sophistication beyond previous European experience. The administrative systems developed for crusading record-keeping, supply management, financial planning influence how European kingdoms organize their own military establishments. Perhaps most significant militarily, the Crusades established the concept of coordinated international military action under ideological justification. The idea that multiple kingdoms can unite for common cause, subordinating individual interests to shared objectives, becomes embedded in European strategic thinking. This concept will be repeatedly invoked, sometimes for genuine collective security, often as justification for imperial aggression. The League of Nations and United Nations are distant descendants of this crusading legacy, secularizing the concept of international coalition against common threats. The political consequences prove equally profound and often perverse. The papacy uses crusading to assert authority over secular rulers. If the Pope can command kings to crusade, then papal authority supersedes royal power in matters defined as spiritual, a category the papacy interprets broadly. This works briefly, but ultimately fails catastrophically. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople demonstrates the papacy's inability to control crusades once armies are in the field. Frederick II's successful but excommunicated crusade shows that crusading can succeed while defying papal authority. By the 14th century, crusading ideology has been so used against heretics in France during the Albigensian Crusade, against political opponents in Italy, as justification for territorial conquest in the Baltic, that it loses moral force. When the papacy calls for crusades, response becomes minimal. The movement's failure and its manipulation for non-religious purposes undermine the very papal authority it was meant to enhance. The Crusades accelerate the decline of feudalism and the rise of centralized monarchies. Financing crusades requires resources beyond feudal obligations. Kings develop taxation systems, administrative bureaucracies, and financial institutions that make them less dependent on noble support. Nobles who crusade often sell lands or rights to raise funds, transferring power to royal administrations. The Crusades require centralized command and professional administration capabilities that serve kings well in consolidating power over fractious nobility. The military order's fate reveals institutional dangers of becoming too successful. The Templars accumulate such wealth and power, essentially a multinational military and financial corporation, answering only to the Pope that they become threatening to secular rulers. Philip IV of France destroys them not because they threaten Christianity, but because they threaten his authority and hold debts he wishes to avoid. The lesson resonates through centuries. Institutions that grow powerful through serving state purposes may eventually be destroyed by those same states when they become inconvenient. The Byzantine Empire's destruction by the Fourth Crusade has consequences extending to modernity. The empire never recovers from 1204's catastrophe. When Michael VIII Palaiologos reclaims Constantinople in 1261, he inherits a devastated city and permanently reduced territories. The empire limps along for 2 more centuries, but it cannot resist Ottoman expansion. In 1453, Constantinople falls to Mehmed II's Ottoman forces. Historians debate whether the Byzantines could have resisted had the Fourth Crusade never occurred. Perhaps Ottoman expansion was inevitable, but certainly the Crusader sack of 1204 removed any possibility that Byzantium could mount effective defense. The direct line from the Fourth Crusade's betrayal to Constantinople's fall to the Ottomans is visible. European crusaders destroyed the empire that might have stopped Ottoman conquest of the Balkans. The long-term consequences include Ottoman control of southeastern Europe for centuries, the creation of the Eastern Question that destabilizes European politics through the 19th century, and the religious political tensions in the Balkans that contribute to the First World War's outbreak in 1914. The Fourth Crusade's unintended consequences echo through 7 centuries. Consider now the religious legacies, which are perhaps most troubling. The Crusades established the concept of holy war in Christianity. Early Christianity was ambivalent about warfare. Christian pacifism existed alongside acceptance that legitimate authority could wage just wars. The Crusades transform this. War becomes not merely permissible, but spiritually meritorious. Killing infidels earns salvation. This theological shift enables centuries of religiously justified violence. The concept extends beyond fighting Muslims. If war against non-Christians is holy, why not war against heretics? The Albigensian Crusade in southern France from 1209 to 1229 employs crusading ideology to destroy the Cathar movement through warfare and massacre. The Northern Crusades in the Baltic employ crusading rhetoric to justify conquest and forced conversion of pagan populations. The Spanish Inquisition and later religious wars employ logic first systematized during crusading. Religious error justifies violent suppression. The relationship between Christianity and Islam is permanently poisoned. Before the Crusades, Christian-Muslim relations involved conflict but also coexistence, cultural exchange, and mutual respect among intellectuals. Muslim-ruled Spain sees extensive Christian-Muslim-Jewish interaction and cultural synthesis. Sicily, under Norman rule, becomes a multicultural center where Greek, Latin, and Arabic scholarship flourish together. The Crusades replace nuance with hostility. Each side develops narratives of the other as irredeemably evil. Christians see Muslims as violent infidels occupying Christian holy sites. Muslims see Christians as aggressive invaders who massacre civilians and cannot be trusted. The propaganda each side develops for recruiting support Christian accounts of Muslim atrocities. Muslim accounts of Crusader barbarity create stereotypes that persist across centuries. Modern Middle Eastern political culture bears crusading scars. When Western powers intervene militarily in the Middle East, the term crusader immediately appears in opposition rhetoric. It is not historical accident but recognition that the Crusades established a pattern. Western military intervention justified by religious or ideological claims, local resistance framed as defense against foreign aggression, and cycles of violence that neither side can escape. The parallels between crusading and later colonialism are too obvious to ignore. Both involve Western powers claiming to bring civilization or true religion to supposedly backward peoples. Both involve military conquest justified by ideological superiority. Both generate resistance that Western powers characterize as irrational fanaticism. The Jewish experience during the Crusades establishes horrific precedents. The First Crusade begins with pogroms in the Rhineland. Crusaders, inflamed with religious fervor and seeking easily available enemies, massacred Jewish communities in Worms, Mainz, Cologne, and other cities. Thousands die. The pattern repeats throughout crusading history. Whenever crusading fervor peaks, Jewish communities face violence. This violence establishes templates for later anti-Semitism. The blood libel accusations that Jews murder Christian children for ritual purposes spreads during crusading periods. Economic resentment combines with religious hostility to make Jews convenient scapegoats. The expulsions of Jews from England in 1290 and France in 1306 occur in the crusading era and employ logic similar to crusading ideology. Religious purity requires eliminating non-Christian presence. The Holocaust's roots are complex and cannot be reduced to any single cause. But the medieval persecution of Jews, intensified and legitimized during the crusading era, establishes patterns of thought and action that culminate in 20th century genocide. The Crusades do not cause the Holocaust, but they contribute to the long history of European anti-Semitism that makes it possible. For Islamic civilization, the crusading legacy is equally complex. The initial response to Crusader invasion is shock. How did barbarian Franks conquer Syrian territories that resisted Byzantine and Persian empires? The shock motivates the jihad movement that eventually expels Crusaders. Nur ad-Din and Saladin frame their campaigns as Islamic renewal, returning to pure faith and proper governance. This creates precedent for linking military political action with religious revival. But the Crusades also reveal Islamic disunity. The Crusaders conquered initially because Muslim powers were fragmented and fighting each other. This lesson is learned and repeatedly invoked. Muslim weakness stems from disunity. Strength requires unity under proper leadership. This becomes a recurring theme in Islamic political thought, used to justify both genuine reform movements and authoritarian consolidation of power. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258 is catastrophic for Islamic intellectual culture. The libraries burned, the scholars killed, the institutional infrastructure demolished. These losses cannot be calculated precisely, but their impact is undeniable. The Islamic world's intellectual center shifts westward to Cairo and eventually to Ottoman Istanbul. The Eastern Islamic world, centered on Baghdad for half a millennium, never recovers its former intellectual prominence. Whether the Mongols would have destroyed Baghdad absent the Crusades is debatable, but certainly Crusader Muslim warfare weakened the Abbasid Caliphate's capacity to resist and created strategic chaos that Mongol invasion exploited. The military success of the Mamluks establishes a governance model that spreads throughout the Islamic world. Slave soldiers, trained from childhood and loyal to the institution rather than tribe or family, prove militarily superior to traditional armies. This model is adopted by the Ottomans with their Janissaries and by various other Islamic states. It creates effective military forces but also political instability. Military elites frequently overthrow civilian rulers, creating cycles of coup and counter-coup that plague some Islamic countries into the modern era. Turn to cultural consequences, which are perhaps most enduring. European knowledge expands dramatically through crusading contacts. Medical knowledge flows from east to west. Islamic physicians have preserved and expanded upon Greek medical texts, developed surgical techniques, and understood anatomy better than Europeans. European medicine advances through translation of Arabic medical works and adoption of Islamic practices. Mathematics and astronomy similarly advance through Eastern contact. The Hindu-Arabic numeral system, infinitely superior to Roman numerals for calculation, enters Europe partly through crusading contacts. Algebraic concepts, astronomical observations, navigational techniques all flow into Europe through the increased interaction crusading creates. Architecture displays obvious Eastern influence. The pointed arch, so characteristic of Gothic architecture, appears in Islamic buildings centuries before European adoption. Whether Gothic architecture directly derives from Islamic influence or develops independently remains debated, but certainly European architects encounter sophisticated Islamic building techniques during crusading and incorporate some principles. Literature is enriched through crusading tales. The chivalric romance, a literary genre celebrating knightly virtue and adventure, draws heavily on crusading narratives. Works like the Chanson de Roland, which predates crusading but is reinterpreted through crusading lens, establish the crusader knight as literary hero. This literary tradition influences European culture for centuries, creating idealized visions of medieval warfare that bear little relation to historical reality but shape how Europeans understand their past. The concept of chivalry itself is transformed through crusading. Pre-crusade knighthood is essentially about military prowess and feudal obligation. Crusading adds religious and moral dimensions. The ideal knight fights for Christ, protects the weak, and embodies Christian virtues. This idealized chivalry never matches reality. Knights remain violent, self-interested warriors, but the ideal influences how medieval nobility conceive their role and how later generations romanticize medieval warfare. The crusading legacy in military culture extends to modernity. Military orders that developed during crusading with their vows, ranks, and institutional loyalty prefigure modern military organization. The concept of professional soldiers dedicated to service beyond personal gain, willing to die for cause rather than plunder, becomes embedded in European military culture. This helps enable the development of professional standing armies that replace feudal levies. The notion of war as ideological struggle, not merely territorial dispute or dynastic conflict, becomes established. Wars are fought for civilization, for religion, for values, not just for land or wealth. This ideological justification for warfare reaches its peak in 20th century total wars, where entire societies mobilize for struggles framed as existential conflicts between good and evil. The rhetorical patterns echo crusading. Enemies are not merely opponents but embodiments of evil that must be utterly destroyed. Consider the legacy's geographic scope. The Baltic Crusades, conducted by Teutonic knights and other military orders against pagan populations in Prussia and the Eastern Baltic, established German presence in Eastern Europe that endures for 7 centuries. The Teutonic knights create a state in Prussia that eventually becomes the Kingdom of Prussia, which unifies Germany in 1871. The direct line from Baltic Crusades to modern Germany is historically traceable. The Reconquista in Spain runs parallel to crusading in the Holy Land. Christian kingdoms in northern Spain gradually conquer Muslim territories to the south, completing the process with Granada's fall in 1492, the same year Columbus sails to the Americas. The Reconquista employs crusading ideology and receives papal support as crusading. It creates a Spanish national identity centered on Catholic faith and military conquest that shapes Spanish imperialism in the Americas. The conquistadors who conquer Mexico and Peru are direct heirs to Reconquista tradition, employing similar rhetoric of Christian civilization triumphing over paganism. The Portuguese expansion into the Atlantic and around Africa to the Indian Ocean is explicitly framed as continuing crusading. Portuguese explorers seek to outflank Muslim powers by reaching the Indies directly, to find the legendary Prester John a supposed Christian king in Africa or Asia who could be allied against Muslims and to spread Christianity. When Vasco da Gama reaches India in 1498, he views it partly as strategic victory over Islam. The European colonial empires that grow from 15th century exploration employ rhetoric and justifications descended from crusading. This is perhaps crusading's most pervasive legacy, the template for religious and ideological justification of imperial expansion. The Crusades establish patterns of thought that spreading true religion justifies conquest, that civilization has duty to uplift barbarism, that military power serves moral purposes that recur throughout European imperialism. The civilizing mission of 19th century colonialism, the white man's burden rhetoric, the belief that Western values should be imposed globally, all echo crusading logic. The Crusades fail in their immediate objectives but succeed in establishing enduring patterns. 2 centuries of crusading warfare prove that permanent conquest of the Holy Land is impossible given demographic realities, geographic challenges, and Muslim resistance. But they also prove that ideological justification can mobilize enormous resources, that religious authority can be wielded for political purposes, and that military expeditions generate consequences far beyond their stated goals. Stand today in Jerusalem, that city fought over so bitterly. It is Israeli, the product of 20th century conflicts having everything to do with nationalism and colonialism, and only tangential connection to medieval crusading. Yet the Crusader presence is visible. Churches built by Crusaders, fortress ruins, the layout of the old city, partly shaped by Crusader occupation. Muslim, Jewish, and Christian holy sites coexist in uneasy proximity, contested by religious communities whose hostilities are partly descended from crusading-era conflicts. The Dome of the Rock stands as it has since the 7th century, golden dome gleaming, third holiest site in Islam. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, site of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection according to Christian belief, receives pilgrims from around the world. The Western Wall, Judaism's holiest site, draws worshippers daily. These 3 great monotheistic faiths share Jerusalem uneasily, their historical grievances including but extending far beyond the Crusades. The Crusades are history distant, medieval, seemingly irrelevant to modern concerns, yet their legacies persist in ways both obvious and subtle. The political geography of the Mediterranean bears crusading influence. The relationship between Christianity and Islam carries crusading scars. European military culture, commercial institutions, and political thought show crusading impact. The very concept of religiously or ideologically justified international military action is crusading legacy. In the end, what do the Crusades teach us? Perhaps this, that stated objectives and actual consequences often diverge dramatically. The Crusades aimed to secure Christian control of Jerusalem and failed completely. But they transformed European commerce, military organization, political institutions, and intellectual culture. They enriched Italian cities, weakened the Byzantine Empire, poisoned Christian-Muslim relations, established precedents for religious violence, and created patterns of thought that influence modernity. Strategic enterprises have consequences beyond their immediate goals. The Crusaders who marched east in 1096 imagined they were liberating Jerusalem for Christianity. They could not imagine they were initiating processes that would transform European civilization, destroy the Byzantine Empire, enable Italian commercial dominance, contribute to the Renaissance, establish templates for later imperialism, and create religious hostilities lasting into the 21st century. The Crusades remind us that strategic choices have long-term consequences impossible to foresee. They demonstrate that ideological justifications for warfare, while effective for mobilization, can mask and ultimately serve interests having nothing to do with stated purposes. They show that military expeditions, no matter how justified they seem to participants, generate suffering far exceeding any possible gain. And they illustrate that 2 centuries of warfare, enormous expenditure of resources, and countless deaths can achieve nothing lasting beyond the suffering inflicted and the hatreds generated. The 4 bronze horses still stand in Venice, silent testimony to crusading legacy. They are beautiful, ancient, and stolen much like crusading itself. The Crusades produced beauty in architecture and literature, recovered ancient knowledge, and enriched European culture. But they did so through conquest, massacre, and betrayal. They are humanity at its most contradictory, capable of great devotion and terrible cruelty, of strategic brilliance and catastrophic miscalculation, of genuine faith and complete cynicism. 200 years, hundreds of thousands dead, empires destroyed, cities sacked, cultures transformed, and in the end, the Crusaders were expelled. Jerusalem remained Muslim, and the Holy Land saw no peace, only the exchange of one set of rulers for another, with the suffering populations bearing the cost. History offers no simple moral. The Crusades were too complex, too prolonged, too varied in their manifestations for easy judgment. They were crusade and crime, pilgrimage and plunder, faith and fraud. They were humanity pursuing transcendent purpose and base greed, often simultaneously, often indistinguishably. The lesson, if there is one, is caution. Caution about religious justifications for warfare. Caution about stated purposes and hidden interests. Caution about enterprises that promise redemption through violence. Caution about certainty, about righteousness, about the belief that our cause justifies any means. The Crusaders believed absolutely in their cause. They were certain of their righteousness. They were wrong not in their faith, which is not for history to judge, but in their certainty that military conquest could serve spiritual purposes without corruption and catastrophe. Perhaps that is the Crusades' ultimate legacy. A warning about the dangers of absolute certainty combined with military power, of righteousness wielded through violence, of faith deployed for conquest. It is a warning that echoes through centuries, relevant in every age that believes its values justify war against those who think differently. The Crusades ended in 1291, when the last crusader left Acre. Their consequences endure still, in ways both visible and subtle, shaping the world we inhabit. Understanding them requires looking beyond medieval chronicles to trace how strategic choices, ideological commitments, and human ambitions combine to produce legacies far exceeding any participant's imagination. The story of the Crusades is not just medieval history. It is a study in how civilizations interact through warfare, how religion and politics intertwine, how stated purposes and actual consequences diverge, and how 2 centuries of conflict can reshape cultures for a millennium. It is a story without simple heroes or villains, without clear moral lessons, but with profound implications for understanding human civilization's capacity for both greatness and horror, often simultaneously, often indistinguishably, always consequentially.